You're going to see where it says go live. You see where it says you're live?
Yeah.
And now what do you think when you see that?
It just says you just went live. I don't.
And so you're thinking we just went live, right?
Yeah.
No. So what I did, I got a laptop. I got another laptop. You see, I got two of these things now. So what I do then is I double check. I go to my laptop. So I'm on a computer right now, but I go to my other laptop because I want to see that I'm really here. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Twitter. Okay.
I'm on Twitter now. I see us on your Twitter page.
You could be in on it.
Yeah.
Okay. You could be in on it. It's the man. The man's taken over. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to check my profile. I didn't even know you were on Twitter. You're on Twitter?
I don't have a personal account. I just go online and read other people's stuff. I found you on Twitter.
I'm crazy, right? I'm crazy on Twitter. I always say something that's going to piss somebody off at some time, so just be aware of that, okay? I even piss myself off. Sometimes I even delete my own tweets because I'm like, I hate this. Okay, so hold on a second. Now what I'm going to do, I don't see us yet. Don't see us. So let me ask you a question. When you're refreshing on your computer, do you press refresh? How do you press refresh? Do you press like all the way up on the left hand? Do you press that like that circly thing?
I just, all I do is just re-enter the URL.
Okay. No. I'm going to tell you something. Okay? F5. So now what I'm doing, okay, is I still don't see us. And I'm F5ing like a crazy person over here. I'm just going crazy. So now what I do is I'm going to go back. Hold on. I'm going to go back. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to double check. Okay, let me see. Guess what, Keith? Guess what? Guess what just happened?
What's that?
We went live. We're live. We did it.
On. Good.
We did it. And now, you know what happens now?
What's that?
You like my music?
It's good. Yeah, it's interesting.
It's great. So, it's great. It's Hindi. Okay? It's very important music. It's relaxing though, right? You feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now what I do is I got to turn it down. I got to turn down my music. So this is the medicine Buddha. It's a healing mantra. I say this hundreds of times a day. Right? Nancy and I, when we go to sleep, we say this. So, but I'm going to turn it down now. But it's calming, right? So that's it. Okay, this is what happened now. I double checked that we really are live. Okay, so now look, you see that? Hi, Adam. I see you've been too long. Thank you so much for joining us. And it has kind of been too long, right? So we're live, right? You see that? We're live. So now what I did is I checked that we're really live, right? I saw myself on Twitter. I turned down my music. And now, Keith, we did it. We're live. Would you be kind enough to introduce yourself? Would that be all right?
Yeah. I am Keith Preston. I am the editor of a website called attackthesystem.com. I've been involved with, I guess you could say, dissident politics in the United States for about a third of a century now. I've written about half a dozen books in the process, and I've been involved in a lot of activities related to that. I'm probably most well known for being an anarchist and a somewhat heterodox and controversial one. And beyond that, I guess it's just a matter of what else do you want to know about me?
So how did you become kind of an anarchist? And also, could you help me better understand what that is and kind of the different kind of iterations and variations of it?
Sure. Well, on a personal level, I didn't get into that in the way that many people do. Many people who become interested in anarchism do so through activist culture or through subcultures like punk music or something like that, or perhaps through the arts culture. I was always interested in things like political theory, political philosophy, history, the social sciences, anthropology, all of these different kinds of fields. And it was through my interest in that I first discovered anarchism as a collection of political philosophies. I think probably the first time I ever heard of anarchism, I was probably 16 or 17 when I heard of William Godwin, who was an Enlightenment figure. He was the father-in-law of Percy Bysshe Shelley and the father of Mary Godwin, who wrote the Frankenstein novel, and he was also the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was an early feminist who wrote The Vindication of the Natural Rights of Women. That was the first anarchist I ever heard of, but I never really followed up on that, though, until I was in my 20s. My early 20s, I started studying philosophy and psychology and the social sciences and theology and political theory. And it was through that I discovered anarchism and all the different variations and permutations of anarchism. So I became interested in anarchism through that kind of intellectual trajectory, not so much through associations. I was an anarchist before I ever knew any other anarchists. So I guess you could say I started thinking of myself as an anarchist when I was probably around maybe 21 years old, something like that. So very early 20s. So I've never been anything other than an anarchist, at least not as an adult. So that's my backstory. As far as what anarchism is, I think you can use multiple definitions, but James Corbett, he's an anarchist podcaster. He once said that anarchism is sort of an ecosystem of philosophies. It's not really one philosophy. And then there's another anarchist writer named Alejandro de Agasta who said that anarchism is a decentralized federation of philosophies, as well as ways of life, practices, communities, and geohistory. So that's a mouthful there. But what he's saying is that it's really sort of anarchism is, as Corbett said, it's an ecosystem of ideas that intersect with each other and sort of reinforce one another, but also very different. I also once heard another political scientists say that there are about as many different types of anarchists as there are other ideologies put together. And while that's maybe an exaggeration, it's only a slight exaggeration. There's also plenty of people who have tried to fuse anarchism with lots of other ideologies, probably about every other ideology there is. Any idea anybody's ever had, somebody somewhere has put an anarcho label in front of it. You can go on social media and find that. You can go on Facebook and look through Facebook groups for anarchists, and you'll see, goth anarchists and solar punk anarchists and zeitgeist anarchists and all kinds of things. Some of which are in contradiction to each other. I think an analogy that works is this. You could compare. You could say that in the realm of political theory, anarchism is kind of like what Christianity is in the realm of theology or religion. Christianity is the world's largest religion, but it is subdivided into probably hundreds of thousands of sectarian groups, many of which are not even recognizable when you compare them with each other, many of whom do not consider each other to be legitimate. But they all still have this kind of, Christian label or this kind of Christ narrative that they somehow are derived from. I mean, you've got the high church Episcopalians, and then you've got the snake handlers in a garage in Kentucky somewhere. And yet all of that is Christian. And I think anarchism is kind of like that as well. You have anarchists who are technophiles and anarchists who are very against technology, who are admirers of the Unabomber. You have anarchists who think of themselves as socialists or communists or some kind of collectivists. You have anarchists who are extreme individualists. You have anarchists who are pacifists. You have
can anarchism? Oh, I hear an echo. I hear an echo. I think on my side, right? I think it's on your side. Keith, if there's anything you can do, so maybe you can mute it on your side. I don't hear it. It's gone. It's gone. It's gone. It was a fluke. I told you, technology. Don't trust them. So, but can anarchism operate? Can anarchism become a people operating system in itself? Is there any way that an anarchist system can operate a complex people system?
Yeah, well, I'd say that in many things that go on a day-to-day basis are implicitly anarchistic in nature. Any kind of time that humans organize themselves in a way that represents voluntary cooperation, they're essentially practicing anarchism. And this happens in many different kinds of contexts. It's, for instance, in something like a household, right? You have a system of voluntary cooperation where, yeah, you may have parents that have the final authority over children or something like that, but people in a household or in a neighborhood or in a community or in any other kind of environment don't engage in voluntary cooperation, or don't refrain from engaging in aggression solely because they're afraid of consequences. Like for example, is it true that the only reason that most people are not serial killers is because they are merely afraid of the lethal injection? Probably not. Okay, even if it became somehow magically legal to be a serial killer, probably most people would not become serial killers. They might have other, personal reasons or social reasons or whatever reasons for not doing that. There's the minority that would, but it is what it is. So in many different contexts, people practice what is essentially anarchism. Anytime you have a system that is functioning in a way that voluntary cooperation is the standard model that's being utilized, that is more or less anarchism in practice. And you see that in many different kinds of contexts. The question is scale. How large is your scale? It can be something that's very microcosmic, like a household. There are voluntary associations, voluntary organizations that function on a transnational basis as well. So it's not true that you have to have the coercive apparatus of the state to motivate people to get anything done or accomplish anything.
So and there's a really interesting question. I'm going to put it up here. Hey, Paul, so good to see you. Did I move to Britain? Not yet. I'm not moving to Britain. I could never move to Britain. All of Nancy's friends are out in Britain protesting. So I don't even know if we're eligible to go to Britain right now, I guess, right? We're not going to go to Britain. That is one of my favorite book chests. So thank you so much for joining us and being such a wonderful philanthropist, and also being such a wonderful advocate for Bitcoin, which I've adopted as well. And it's kind of the anarchist money tool. What do you think about that? Keith, what do you think about Bitcoin as kind of a currency of anarchism?
Well, that's an interesting question. I know anarchists who have a very reverential attitude towards Bitcoin. I tend to be somewhat more skeptical. I like the idea of alternative currencies. If you don't want to use this currency, just use another one. I like the idea of creating independent currencies and independently of state-issued currency systems. On the other hand, I don't think it's the kind of cure-all that some people have made it out to be. Ultimately, if the state doesn't want you using Bitcoin, they can simply come to your house and take your computer and put you in jail. In fact, there are some folks in New Hampshire now who are now under federal indictment for some Bitcoin-related issues. Bitcoin hasn't really turned out to have the subversive potential that I think some people initially thought it would have, or that some people promoted it as having. But it's not a concept that I'm opposed to, or it's only something that I don't really engage in personally.
But there has to be some type of a way for anarchism, and I'm saying this without even really truly understanding what anarchism is. So we're going to definitely be discussing that throughout. But just in terms of my superficial understanding of anarchism, there has to be some type of an exchange that happens, kind of financial transactions and everything that defies the system, because you've even identified yourself as ideologically kind of part of your identity as a dissident, I suppose, right? As a dissent, and it has to express itself outside of the system as much as it can.
Well, there are all kinds of ideas that different types of anarchists have had about how a system of exchange might work outside the state. Everything from alternative currency to techno currency or cryptocurrency and labor notes and all kinds of things. I mean, some years ago there was a guy who had a project called the Liberty Dollar that he was running. All of that is a very old idea. But yeah, it's one of the ideas that you find in anarchist theory, at least certain tendencies within anarchism, is the idea of dual power, which is the idea that you build sort of an alternative infrastructure that exists outside of the existing institutional apparatus or state apparatus or ruling class apparatus. You find this among different types of anarchists, left and right anarchists. The Wobblies, the IWW, they were sort of an anarcho-syndicalist group that existed back in the early 20th century. Well, they're technically still around, but they're not really what they once were. But they had this slogan. It was called building the new society in the shell of the old. And the idea was sort of like you build an alternative infrastructure, dual power, counter power, it's sometimes been called. There was another anarchist theorist named Sam Konkin. He called this agorism, and he also had this term called counter economics. But the idea is you basically build an alternative infrastructure and then kind of pull the rug out from underneath the system because you don't need the system anymore. And certainly things like alternative currencies and all that can.
Well, so now I want to continue on with this. I'm very interested. I was a Bitcoin skeptic, right? A skeptic or a cynic, I don't know, right? But one of them, I didn't think it was going to take off, or I thought that it would have its peaks and valleys. But in terms of kind of getting widespread adoption and becoming and gaining some type of a legitimacy, I didn't think it was going to happen. Largely because of kind of there's an asymmetricalness to the information that's out there. It's got its own vernacular. It's very difficult to know when to buy it or when to sell it, right? You don't know what your point of entry is, and there's not a lot of information that's going to help you. There's a lot of momentum. Nevertheless, I became a buyer. I did something with Milton Demir's, and I became a buyer. And one of the ways that I was very interested in the way she expressed it was that it's a way for people to regain their sovereignty.
Right. Well, there are many ideas like that that exist on many different levels in terms of alternative infrastructure. Another idea that some types of anarchists are interested in is things like workers' cooperatives, and they will point to.
But hold on, can I just continue for 1 second with that? Because I'm so interested in the way you look at it, and that's also because I've heard you so many times, and I've gone to your podcast that you do so many times, and they're so extremely well informed, and I know you have a lot of academic familiarity with this also. But I am curious about Bitcoin as kind of a lever that dissidents can use to kind of create some type of even restore an equilibrium between the relationship between the state and kind of the pleb.
Yeah, it's helpful in that regard. I mean, it's certainly helpful as a type of alternative currency you can use within a certain set of contextual limits, because you're still submerged in an economic system that's still subordinated to the state. And I think I was going to use the analogy of worker cooperatives, though that has the same problem. There are some people who point to things like Mondragon, which is a worker cooperative system in Spain, and they'll say, well, isn't that a great model enterprise? You're not depending on corporations. Yeah, but it's still submerged in this state-dominated and corporate-dominated economy. And I think that Bitcoin has the same problem. So they're all models, I'd say quasi-models or proto-models for a type of alternative infrastructure, but I don't know that by themselves they have a revolutionary potential. They have this, they're sort of, I guess you could say, a halfway point between where we are and where we're trying to go if you're interested in anarchism.
So do you see it right now? And again, I'm really not a Bitcoiner, but I've become so interested in it because I think it was also Milton. I think Bill was a part of that. So thank you very much. In my conversations with Anthony Pompliano, where they feel that there's kind of like an army, right? And that it's an army that exists online, and also, of course, offline. That it transfers to an offline life. They have a good deal of social economic currency capital, right? So they can manage themselves politically and make themselves a force, as well as just as this kind of online army. There is, as we saw from GameStop. I don't know if you've been watching that, or AMC.
Right.
Yeah. So there is this kind of an exponential quality to it that it is is that a dissident, and at the same time, is that part of an ad hoc right now, kind of an ad hoc solution to resisting the state, in particular where we're seeing the dollar being devalued so quickly?
I think it's a partial solution. It's a partial solution. Yeah, it's one of these many halfway points. Yeah, there many people who are involved in Bitcoin are not political radicals or anything like that. I mean, for many of them, it's just a business investment or something that they find convenient for some other reason, and that's fine. I mean, I think that what you're saying about Bitcoin has some potential in that regard. I wouldn't deify Bitcoin the way I've seen some people do, but it's conceptually interesting.
I have found it that way also. I sold recently because Elon Musk said sell. And if I have a choice between Elon Musk or Bitcoin, I'm going to go with Elon Musk. Elon Musk is the Tom Cruise of technology. It's amazing. So what do you think about Tom Cruise?
I know very little about Tom Cruise.
Okay.
He's a Scientologist, and I find that to be a turn off. And other than that, I know very little about him.
He's a dissident.
Yeah,
that's the way he's a dissident. But okay, so I'm going to go backwards a little bit because I really did get us off on a tangent, but I was just so interested in it. We were discussing kind of if there's kind of a federation, I suppose, of anarchists and of the different types of anarchists that can actually run and can manage a people operating system and run all the intricacies and complexities required of a people operating system, like a republic, I suppose.
Right.
Or is anarchism always something that's kind of utilized by the resistance, and it has to be an outside force?
Well, I think it can be either one. You can find plenty of resistance efforts that have existed historically and today that are either explicitly or implicitly anarchists. Sometimes they may call themselves anarchists. Other times they may be engaging in the kind of ideas anarchists often promote. One famous example is Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha movement. That's one example. But I think that once you get past this point of just pure resistance, it's possible to have what might be called an operating system where you have anarchistic principles being applied, because you have a system of organization from the bottom up where you have sort of a network that's federated or confederated based on voluntary association and free association and voluntary cooperation and mutual aid and all of these kinds of principles, without a uniform system being imposed from the top down, which is what you have with traditional systems of statecraft. And again, we can find all kinds of examples of this. There are many organizations that exist all over the place that are not part of the state. I mean, they may be submerged in a state-saturated or state-dominated society, so that is an issue. But you still have plenty of organizations that function in a way that is voluntary association is their basic paradigm. Everything from religious institutions to fraternities to guilds to at least certain kinds of labor organizations, certain kinds of business organizations, certain kinds of educational associations, all sorts of interest groups and clubs and all sorts of things. And many different kinds of groups function in a way where membership is voluntary. The internal system of organization is primarily based on voluntary association and voluntary cooperation, where collaboration with other groups is based on free association or free federation or mutual aid or any of these anarchistic principles. And that's how an anarchistic system works. We're
going to skip around, but I'm just so interested. There's some questions here, and I'm going to go to one of the questions because it's so interesting, and then I want to go back because I really am interested in how anarchism can be used today. And is anarchism always going to be battling with other anarchist groups into which one is kind of the truer anarchist ideology? So there's a question here from Thomas Norman, and if I recall correctly, Thomas Norman appreciates the philosophy, and this I could be wrong, of a person I don't know that much about, to be honest with you. So I can't give any type of I can't give any type of review of whether I agree with them or not or anything, but I know that they're very popular. Is it Stephen Molyneux, right? Is that correct? That's a philosopher, right?
I know who Stephen Molyneux is. Yeah, he's a type of anarchist. He's sort of okay. He's within a genre that's called anarcho-capitalism. I think he has some kind of alt-rightish, kind of alt-light leanings as well, but Yeah, he's kind of within the pan-anarchist umbrella.
Yeah, interesting. And so Thomas Norman, thank you so much for joining us. Says, as an anarchist, what types of things can an individual do to have a positive effect on the world?
Well, that's a pretty open-ended question, and depends on what you define as a positive effect on the world, and what specifically you want to accomplish. I don't know that there's any one answer to that. There are anarchists who do all kinds of things. There are anarchists who do conventional political activism around some kind of issue they're interested in. There are anarchists who trade in Bitcoin. There are anarchists who organize worker cooperatives. There are anarchists who are tax resistors or something like that. There are anarchists who are hermits who go off and kind of live by themselves and kind of live off the grid.
Is a common element within anarchists kind of a desire to bring down the state or not?
Well, that all depends on what kind of anarchist you're dealing with. I used to say that anarchists really don't agree on anything except they're all opposed to the state as a primary principle, and I don't even know if that's the case. You have anarchists certainly who say opposition to government is their primary objective, and statelessness is a primary, at least it's a primary end game. But then you also have anarchists who place more emphasis on anti-capitalism, almost like a socialist idea. You have others that are more opposed to technology. You have some that are pacifists that are more opposed to violence. You have some that are feminists that are more interested in patriarchy. You've got atheist anarchists that are anti-clerical, anti-organized religion. You have egoists, or you have even more extreme viewpoints like illegalists, or what are sometimes called red marketers. These are people who just kind of have a survival of the fittest, do your own thing, anything goes philosophy. That's another issue when it comes to things like moral philosophy, ethics, all of that. There's no consensus about those ideas among anarchists either. Anarchism is sort of like this open-ended philosophy that has plenty of internal paradoxes and dichotomies and often contradictions in terms of the different sectarian groups that are out there. So in terms of how you want to affect the world, that could depend on any number of things. It depends on what kind of changes you want to see in the world and how you would think that would be the best way to get there. That's not a question that there's a precise answer to.
So do anarchists, and I know these are complex questions, which is why I'm so excited to have you here, because I've spent so much time listening to you both on Cotto Gottfried, where I know you've done it at least twice because I've listened to both of them, and on your own website and your own podcast that you do. A lot of people could not handle some of the questions. Did you know that? It's easy just to have a script and kind of stick to it and replay that script and add some kind of novelties to it. But it's hard to really be responsive to things that are not included within that script and kind of things that are off. So I'm really excited about this. Does Antifa, what is the relationship between Antifa and anarchists? Because typically, don't they have that that they use?
Yeah. There are people who are involved with Antifa or Antifa, however you want to pronounce it, who identify as anarchists. There are also people who are involved with Antifa who identify as communist or socialist and probably all kinds of other things. And then there are anarchists of different types who are very critical of the Antifa paradigm as well. Among different types of anarchists, you have those who identify, you have many anarchists who do identify with the political left, but you have others that don't. You have others that identify more with something like closer to libertarianism or even elements of the right. But you also have with a subculture of left anarchists who are interested in this Antifa milieu, anti-fascism as that's an abbreviated term for anti-fascism. You have anarchists that are involved in that, and then you have anarchists who are anti-Antifa. And you could probably find that about any controversy. That's kind of like saying, do anarchists believe in private property? Well, some do, some don't. Do anarchists believe in violence? Some do, some don't. Or anarchists against religion? Some are and some aren't. That fits. So you have so many different categories that they all fit into these different niches depending on their orientation.
And so I want to thank Bawash. And I have so many questions, but then I look through the questions and they're better than my questions. So Bawash, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And if I recall, I have a good memory. right? That's a bad thing because I remember everything. I'd rather maybe have not such a good memory, maybe 50-50, right? So Bawash, thank you so much for joining us. And if I recall, you're from Canada, and perhaps it was Toronto. So thank you so much for joining us. And Bawash says, aren't anarchists, this is a two-part question, aren't anarchists supposed to be conservative, and that there are fundamental transcendental principles and manners that must persist for people to interact with the least amount of government intervention?
There are some anarchists who would agree with that statement, and there are some who wouldn't. There are some anarchists who are moral skeptics, who are more influenced by, say, Nietzsche, or Max Stirner, or maybe Hume, some of those thinkers, who say ultimately there's no such thing as right and wrong. Values are something you create for yourself. There are others who might hold to some kind of, objective ethics or something like that. Whether it's, it could be anything, some deontological ethics or care ethics or virtue ethics or whatever. I think, though, that the question raises a really valid point and that is the point that's being made is it not necessary for people to exercise self-restraint or self-discipline in order for anarchism to work? For example, if in a society where there's no government saying you cannot do all these things, wouldn't it be necessary for people to engage in self-restraint? And there are anarchists who are committed to this idea. They say, well, you engage in self-restraint so that government doesn't have to restrain you. You refrain from theft and murder and rape and all these other things, so you don't need government. So yeah, some anarchists have different ideas as to how you would achieve that. There are some who think, well, humanity has to evolve to the point where humans sort of evolve out of these kind of violent tendencies, or people have to be educated out of these kinds of things. Or, there are religious anarchists who say, well, you need a religious commitment to not doing these kinds of things, or you need some kind of profound moral commitment. But that is a valid point, and it's an interesting point, because there is this question of, well, the more internal restraints someone has, the fewer external restraints they're going to have.
Thank you so much for that. And Rising Serpent is here. Thank you so much for joining us. And Rising Serpent asks, talk about anarcho-pluralism and the hegemonic monopoly of big corporate.
Anarcho-pluralism is a term that I started to use years ago to describe more or less what we're talking about now, which is the fact that anarchism as a philosophy is, I guess anarchism's plural is really more of an appropriate term, because it is such an open-ended philosophy with so many different segues and internal ecosystems and things like that. And I started to use the term anarcho-pluralism as an umbrella term for these ideas. Now, I didn't invent the term. Where I got the term anarcho-pluralism from was from a man named Sam Dolgoff, whom I met back in the late 80s. At the time, he was probably in his 90s, and he had been a part of the historic anarchist movement back in the early 20th century, when anarchism was actually a very large movement. And I remember asking him once, I said, I was talking about some of these different types of anarchists. I'm like, are you an anarcho-syndicalist? Are you an anarcho-communist? What are you? He said, I'm an anarcho-pluralist, meaning he advocated a plurality of anarchist philosophies and practices and tendencies or whatever. So that has stuck with me for the last third of a century or so. And I started using it in this kind of to describe this open-ended approach to anarchism. So that's what anarcho-pluralism is. As far as the hegemonic monopoly of big corporate, right now we seem to be in an interesting historical situation, because we're largely experiencing a repeat of the 19th century. In the 19th century, what we saw was a time of very, very rapid technological development in a way that was unprecedented. And along with that, we saw the rise of a new ruling class that was outside of the traditional ruling classes. And we also saw at the same time enormous progress in the human condition on one hand, but then enormous polarization between the haves or have-nots, or social classes or whatever. And we're seeing the same thing today. We're seeing very, very rapid technological progress in ways that are beneficial in many instances. But that's also creating this new ruling class of these tech oligarchs. These guys like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, who was some of the other, Tim Cook, all of these people are the modern equivalent of John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford, these robber barons, what they called the robber barons back in the 19th century. These new tech oligarchs are becoming the modern version of that. And like the same way the robber barons and their counterparts in other countries replaced the older ruling class. A traditional ruling class was the royal dynasties, the hereditary titled aristocracies, the clerical dynasties. The Industrial Revolution changed that, where you had the rise of these business tycoons that became the new ruling class that replaced these older ruling classes. And the same process is happening now, where you have the rise because of technological change and the economic changes that have accompanied that. You have a situation where you have this new class of tech oligarchs that is largely superseding what we thought of as the ruling class in past times. For example, in the past we would think of who were the ruling class. It was the prominent families. It was the Rockefellers and Kennedys and the Hunts and Mellons and Carnegies and all of that, and all of the structure of the power elite that's associated with that. And what we're starting to see now is this new ruling class that doesn't come from the traditional elite. These are not people who inherited their position. They come from outside the traditional elite, but they've managed to accumulate enough wealth and enough private power that they're able to supersede the traditional elite and largely become a new ruling class. There's a social scientist who's written about this named Joel Kotkin, who I think really nails it more than just about any other social science writer out there. He talks about how what we're seeing is this older, ruling class dying out or losing power, and this new tech oligarchy replacing it, along with what he calls the new clerisy. And by new clerisy, he means, of course, clerisy is the traditional term for the clergy, the religious leadership. But he's saying there's this new clerisy that's developing in the form of what some people call the professional managerial class. And that is the knowledge industries, or what I call the ideas industries. And that's things like the media, entertainment, education, journalism, human resources, public relations. It's in all of these kinds of fields that are involved with knowledge and ideas. And they are also the fields that determine the value system for the wider society. In traditional societies, who determined the value system for the wider society? It was religion, typically, in most societies, the church or the equivalent of the church in whatever religion they had. All right, that's largely, the religion has sort of become more marginal, and it's largely been replaced by ideology. Ideologies are the modern religions, and then the ideas industries are now the new churches, whether it's the media, whether it's the educational system, whether it's journalism, whether it's human resources, whether it's public relations, whether it's advertising and marketing, and all these different fields. These are the people who set the values or determine the values of the wider society, and they have certain commonalities. These tend to be affluent, urban, professional class, generally cosmopolitan, by historical standards, liberal in their outlook on many things. And that is really the equivalent of the clergy today. That is our modern clergy. So it's like the tech oligarchs are our modern robber barons, and this professional managerial class of people who specialize in the administration of ideas, the knowledge industries, that is our new clergy.
I've noticed this for many, many years. I started writing about this just in my own blog because I was so interested in trying to get it out of my head and just turn it into something on paper so that I could just explain it to myself a little bit more elegantly. And because I come out of venture capital and I come out of finance, I watched as these things happened. And so although I've kept a log of now, which I call the fastest roll-up of power in history, I think I actually started that log in a way like 20 years ago. And being so close to kind of the formative years of the venture capital rounds of some of these companies as they've grown, I definitely have seen that data became theologized, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I even saw the term big data, if you're familiar with that term. When it took adoption, I noticed that there really wasn't big data, but what its its name gives it some type of celestial infinity. Did you notice that? And
yeah.
I think that it's very interesting. But the other thing I would say is that watching all these technology kids, is that because there's kind of this algorithm as scripture, that the technological religiosity eases the adherence of it from any responsibility for their choices regarding the development, the adoption, and the implementation of their new technologies. So it's interesting because it does, again, because it is a religion, it releases those adherents. They don't feel any more responsibility for deplatforming people and the consequences of it and of all their actions, because for them, resistance is futile. It's the new church. It's just fascinating to me.
Well, what you're describing is a part of what I'm describing. That is that, you do have this among some people who have the value system that we're talking about now. You have this deification of technology, of science, scientism, as it's often been called. They have this deification of progress, and that's something that can be traced all the way back to at least the Enlightenment, to the French Revolution and all of that. So they do have this value system that deifies science, that deifies technology, that deifies progress, and the use of those things for so-called progress with the capital P. But it's also larger than that. That's part of what I'm talking about. But there's also the wider set of social norms and social values. For example, in the 1950s, a status of being a good, decent citizen might have been to denounce communism. Or something like that. Nowadays, it's to affirm your support for gay marriage and make sure that you have a Black Lives Matter sticker on your car or your social media page or something like that. The social norms, the cultural norms may have changed, but the purpose for which they're used has not changed. You have a lot of people that for whom being woke, or nowadays it's been called being woke. A few years ago it was called being a social justice warrior. Before that was called being politically correct. The terminology keeps shifting, but you have a lot of people for whom all of that is, as some people have called it, virtue signaling, and that is you're signifying that you are a good citizen. You're a good and decent person. All decent people believe in this, that, and the other thing. And what that is often used for by many people is a means of ladder climbing. You have a lot of people who use it.
But I want to go back to that religious quality of it. And I know it was somebody's book, and I tried to look it up. Joel Chokin? Was that their name?
Yeah, Joel Kotkin is the person I just mentioned. Kotkin.
Gotcha. I couldn't find it. I will tell you, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. So I'm just glad that it came up. And even though I've lost that opportunity to discuss it further, I'm going to kind of drag it back in because I'm really so fascinated by it. And I know so many tech kids, and I know kids that are super smart, and I try and figure out what's going on and how people can kind of, take all this fake information, fake reality, and make it something real, even though it's not. And so I look at them as kind of their disciples. These kids are all very technologically proficient, right? They're very digitally minded, and from my experience, they all seem to reject traditional religions and superstitions.
Right.
And then it's interesting because when I look at kind of the common denominators amongst them, and I've known a lot of the top people at Google, I've known a lot of the top people even in some of the Chinese Communist Party technology companies such as Tencent, and it just seems to be something that doesn't have any that doesn't have its own sovereignty. It's almost like a QAnon type of thing in its own way. But they've set out. The common element is they all feel that they've set out to come up with a better, more scientific framework. And what they wind up doing is they recreate versions of those old religious superstitions.
Yes.
But in the technical world, and in many ways, those superstitions are just as damaging as what came before, and not just in kind of a metaphorical sense, but at the same time, when I speak with them, it's that same kind of evoking religious emotions of, omnipotence, maybe devotion and awe, and you're right. It's a religion, and it has its own clerical caste, its own kind of arcane rituals, articles of faith. It's just it's fascinating to me. So I'm glad I had a chance to kind of let it go and then bring it right back into the conversation because it's something I think about quite quite often.
Well, I would say that this thing that we have going on in the United States today that we commonly call the culture war is essentially a religious conflict, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. But if you look at the two sides, I call it the red tribe and the blue tribe. If you look at the two sides in that, what you typically see is that on one side you have the red tribe that adheres to what might be called the traditional American civil religion. And this is a real concept. It's Robert Bellah, the sociologist, wrote an essay back in 1967 called the American Civil Religion. And this is basically just the standard idea of America as God's country. You know, it's not really Christianity, but it's not really deism either. It's more of this idea that, God has like this special concern for America, sort of like the historic Redeemer nation or something like that. So you have the red tribe who holds this kind of idea, and they often fuse it with actual traditional religion, whether it's evangelicals or in some cases conservative Catholics or Mormons or Orthodox Jews or whatever. So that's the red tribe. But then on the blue tribe, you have a lot of ideas that are heavily derivative of the older tendencies within modernist Christianity, like the social gospel, progressive Christianity, Unitarianism, and also ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, rationalism, and along with that, this emphasis on progress, on scientism, on the myth of human perfection.
You know why that is? Do you know why that is? I think about this a lot, and I saw it emerging. Is that for them? And I think I heard you mention it once before. There's like an transhumanism, anarchism, or something like that.
There it is.
Which I've seen coming out of venture capital for 25 years, right? And coming out of Wall Street, is that there's a fixation with these kids that just keeps on getting worse and worse. Perhaps, I mean, I can't make that judgment, I guess, right? But that there's a fixation on kind of the godlike. It's a disembodied intelligence, and that you're right. Everything is progress, and that it's all one step more towards kind of a personal immortality. And it's just that movement, and really, I see it as a movement, and I suppose how you've described it is better than I ever could. But it's an algorithmic movement, and it imagines a future that has to come. Right? It's the progress. That progress is not illimitable, and that progress is when there's no longer a distinction between machines and humans, and humanity, as we know, will be eclipsed, and then humanity will play God and bestow kind of God's gifts on itself, which is how they view themselves, which is also very interesting. So you're right. It is kind of this like an endless for those people that I've seen, and it's interesting because they're also fascinated with Russiagate. They're just adherence to all of these type of things, no matter how preposterous these things are. Is that they all think of themselves as kind of being Galileo, this immortal Galileo, in an endless enlightenment, and they all see themselves as vanquishing religion and driving it and using science and technology to do that. So it is kind of interesting that you've seen. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that there was an individual who was sort of considered a precursor to modern anarchist thought named Max Stirner, a German philosopher who lived about 175 years ago. And he saw a lot of this coming. He was describing a lot of the intellectual movements of his time. And we're talking about the early 19th century. And he was saying, he had a phrase, he said, "Our atheists are very pious people." And what he meant by that is you had all of these intellectual movements who thought they were abolishing religion or abolishing traditional values or traditional institutions, but in reality, all they were doing was creating new cults of their own. This guy was a personal acquaintance, for example, of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and he used to ridicule them as, you guys are just Christians, you guys want to create this kind of otherworldly, kingdom of heaven on earth or something like that. Nietzsche is a more famous exponent of this viewpoint. But there's Nietzsche's famous saying "God is dead" is often taken out of context. It's often meant to be sort of an anti-clerical statement, more of like a Bertrand Russell or, like a Richard Dawkins type or somebody like that today. But what he meant was that statement comes from this thing that Nietzsche wrote. It's in one of his books called The Gay Science, which has nothing to do with gay in the modern sense. But in The Gay Science, he has this parable of the madman. It's about this guy who is he's like a madman, and he's sort of like this wandering, crazy religious mystic type. And he enters into a village, and he's saying, "I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God." And all of these people in the village are laughing at him and said, "Don't you know God is dead? We killed him." And they start talking, and there's all these metaphorical analogies. Well, we unhinged the sun from the earth from its chains or whatever. It's talking about how scientific advancements had discredited traditional religion and those kinds of things. And then the madman is sort of making fun of them, saying, "Oh, my time hasn't yet come because you don't understand. You've really just created new religions to believe in." And what Nietzsche was attacking was attacking ideas that came out of the 19th century. A lot of the intellectual currents, like socialism, communism, liberalism, this belief in the magic of progress, the worship of science, the worship of technology, the worship of rationality, also nationalism, and all of the different kinds of intellectual currents that came out of the 19th century European intellectual culture. Nietzsche was ridiculing all that stuff, saying, these are just new religions, these are new cults, these are new pieties. They haven't done anything to get rid of religion; they've just given it a new form. In fact, if you look at the 20th century totalitarian regimes, or even today, if you look at somewhere like North Korea, what do you see? What you see is the mirror image of some of the ancient tyrannies with their, God emperor cults. Like the cult of like in ancient societies, they often worshiped the emperor, the king, or whatever, as a literal divine figure. For example, the ancient Egyptian pharaohs were considered the descendants of the sun god Ra. Of course, the Romans had their cult of the emperor and all of that. And that, the Japanese believed this as recently as 1945.
Yeah, I'm going to skip around a little bit. Is that all right with you? It's so interesting, and I'm rude, right? I interrupted you. I apologize. I apologize because think of this as like a dinner with friends. And if we were in a restaurant, and what you say is so fascinating, we're going to get back to it. But there's a lot of people here, and I'm so fascinated in their questions, and I was rude. I apologize. Is that okay with you?
No problem.
If I was in a class, I'd raise my hand, right? But we're going to get back to that because it's important. Okay. So it's 6B1222T. Thank you so much for joining us. And this is a two-part question, actually. And thank you so much also for including clouds, because that's nice, right? And it was raining in the city today. So 6B1222T says, two-part question, anarchism, by definition, is an ideology that does not adhere to any form of government, which are you. And then they continue with, in a law-abiding society, is there a valid place for anarchy?
Well, I guess as far as the first question is what kind of anarchist am I? I assume that what the question means is that which of the hyphenated forms of anarchism I hold to, and the answer is not really any of them, unless you call the umbrella terms, like anarcho-pluralism or something like that. An older term for what I am is anarchist without adjectives, in the sense I don't really hold to any of the sectarian tendencies.
Oh, that's awesome.
I'm more interested in the umbrella, the wider umbrella. Like there was an anarchist historian back in the early 20th century named Max Natlau, a German, who traced the history of anarchistic ideas going all the way back to ancient thought. And he argued that really the first anarchist was probably Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism. And he argued that in the West, probably the first anarchist was maybe Zeno or maybe Diogenes, the founder of the Cynics. And he was saying that you can find anarchist and quasi-anarchist thinking throughout all of these ancient cultures and different philosophical systems, and then as tendencies within different religious traditions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, and also within a lot of traditional cultures, you could find quasi-anarchistic ideas. And then all of that starts to crystallize during the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment. You find radical Protestant sects that are quasi-anarchistic. And then in the 19th century, you start to get actual philosophical systems that call themselves anarchist, and then those splinter off into all different kinds of categories. And there's a more recent historian, there's a British historian named Peter Marshall, who's written about this as well. He's got a book called Demanding the Impossible, and he really goes back and traces this whole trajectory all the way back to antiquity, and how the evolution of these kinds of ideas has progressed over time, and how they can be found in all of these different obscure intellectual and cultural byways. And that's really, this kind of open-ended narrative is really the one that I hold to. I don't really, when it comes to these different terms, like, are you an anarcho-syndicalist? Are you a mutualist? Are you an individualist anarchist, an anarcho-communist? I don't really care about any of that stuff.
Is that a phrase that has been around for a long time, anarchist without adjectives?
Yes, it was developed, well, the person who popularized it among American anarchists was Voltairine de Cleyre. She was a female anarchist who lived back in the early 20th century, very early 20th century. I don't think the term is original to her. I think there were some, if I remember my history correctly, I think there were some Cuban anarchists who actually developed that term. I'm not sure if it was used anywhere else before that. So it goes back to the late 19th century, basically. So as long as modern anarchist movements have existed, you've had people that will call themselves anarchism without adjectives. Another term that's been used is anarchism without hyphens. There was a guy, an anarchist around in the 1960s, 1970s named Carl Hess, who used to use that term quite a bit. So that's kind of my framework. I guess the only hyphen I have would be the anarcho-pluralism, or anarcho-ecumenicalism or something. So as far as that question, as far as the other question of would a law-abiding society, what was the question? If you could put okay, in a law-abiding society, is there a valid place for anarchy? Well, that's a somewhat difficult question, because first of all, what do you mean by a law-abiding society? I mean, that's a society. You could have an absolute monarchy. In fact, you could have a Kim family dictatorship that is law-abiding, in the sense that everybody follows the decrees of the state, or the law as it's actually written. Maybe the question, it means something like, well, if people in their own lives, or their own behavior, don't commit crimes or whatever, then is there a valid place for anarchy?
Well, it was phrased, somebody else phrased it, I think, here. So let's use that. Is that all right if we kind of we go from one part of the question, which did have some ambiguity, to here with just kind of the imagery of something, which is the absence of lawlessness, the absence of law?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different anarchist ideas on that. There are some anarchists who literally believe that there should not be in society be law. Now, they may be okay with something like social norms. I mean, they may say, well, there's a lot of things that are social norms that we have that aren't laws. Like, it's a social norm, you're not supposed to pick your nose in public. Okay, if you do that, you're not going to get arrested, but, people might think ill of you, but, that's an ill mannered, kind of gross person, whatever. So there are many anarchists who do not object to social norms, but do object to codified law. There are others who accept the idea of customary law, the idea that, well, the customary law is, you do this for me, I'll do this for you, whatever. There are some anarchists who accept the legitimacy of law as long as it stays within certain limits. Like there's this concept called the non-aggression principle that some anarchists belong to. They say, well, it's okay to have a law that says you can't act aggressively against another person, but that's it. If the law goes any further than that, it's not legitimate law anymore. It's just oppression. It's kind of like the idea, well, my right to swing my fist stops where somebody else's nose starts, or something like that. But if the law says you can't just swing your fist, just to randomly swing your fist, as long as you don't hit anybody, well, then that's oppression. That's another answer you're going to get to this question. The question here I see says the term anarchist conjures up visions of lawlessness. Once again, you have some anarchists who believe that human beings could evolve to the point of living in a community where they don't need laws, because everybody else, just by consensus and self-restraint, doesn't act aggressively against each other. There are other people who say that, who are utopians, who say that, well, it's social institutions and social circumstances and education and parenting and all kinds of things that cause people to be aggressive or antisocial. So if you eliminated that, then you wouldn't have so many antisocial personalities. On the other hand, there are anarchists who go in the other direction. All right, there are anarchists who defend lawlessness. There are anarchists who say that lawlessness is a legitimate form of revolt against tyrannical authority. For instance, there's a tendency called illegalists, and they will typically say that shoplifting, for example, is just fine because what you're doing is you're getting even with the merchants that are selling goods at inflated prices or something like that. You have other anarchists that go even further, that are in favor of terrorism or something like that as a means of resisting tyrannical states. You have some that literally sort of take the anarchist and the pejorative idea literally, and there's one tendency called red marketers, and basically they're just pro-crime. You could just that's really the essence of their philosophy. Crime is okay. It's just every person for themselves. You will find literally the entire spectrum of opinion about this among anarchists, from very noble-minded, idealist, even pacifistic people, all the way over to amoral self-seekers.
Yeah, and there's another follow-up question to that, which I'm now looking for. I hear that echo again. There's a lot of questions here, so I want to go through them. I hear that echo. Now it's gone. Okay, so Clay Space, thank you so much for joining us. And Clay, if I recall correctly, is not only a bull on the stock market as I am, because you got to be, also a Bitcoiner. So they're part of that whole movement that Bill Pulte was discussing before. So Clay Space says Samo Burjo's great founder theory and how civilizations rise and fall. Are you familiar with that at all?
Well, not specifically, but what it sounds like is an idea that's common or used to be common in historical studies. That's called the great man theory of history. There at one point there was a method of historical interpretation that argued that if you look at the history of civilizations or societies, what you often find is there's this single great leader who really has an inspiring vision, and a whole civilization or a whole culture or a whole religion or something gets built up around this guy. And I think you could argue there's some truth to that. If you open up a book, for example, on the history of, say, Western philosophy, and it'll typically be broken down into multiple sections, and it'll start with antiquity, and it'll say, well, in antiquity we had Plato and Aristotle, and maybe in the Roman era Cicero or somebody like that. And then we get into the patristic church fathers, Augustine and Tertullian and those people. And then we get into the Middle Ages, and we've got Aquinas. And then we get into the Reformation era, and we've got Martin Luther and John Calvin and Erasmus of Rotterdam and all these people. And then you've got the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes. And then you've got in modern thought, like say post 18th century thought, you've got Darwin and Marx and Nietzsche and Freud and these other figures. And there's a method of interpreting history that argues that it's really the appearance of like the great individual with their visionary ideas, and that's really the method that pushes history forward in many ways. Now, that method of historical interpretation is not in vogue today in the social sciences and in the historical studies. And I think a lot of this is political and ideological, because the political left tends to control these fields today. But nowadays, the emphasis tends to be more on social history and bottom-up historical interpretation. So you'll say, well, what really matters is what were the people doing on the ground. Like whatever the kings and emperors and all of those people were doing, they could only do it because they had the support of or the pressure from people on the bottom, like slaves engaged in revolts or worker revolts or peasant revolts. So it's kind of like this bottom-up kind of social history that's popular today. I think all of these perspectives have limitations. There's value in all of them. There's value in looking at the role of highly influential singular individuals, and there's also value in looking at what were the common folks doing in older societies, and to what degree did that shape the wider culture. There's always this question of does culture develop from the bottom up, or is it something that's imposed top?
What do you think? What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's all of it. I think it's all of that. Certainly, human beings can engage in spontaneous social organization. Like Friedrich von Hayek, the sociologist and economist, talked about this a lot. He was in this idea of spontaneous order, the idea that people can evolve their own, sort of just through their own interaction, interpersonal interaction, collectively, just sort of spontaneously, without any kind of planning, evolve their own culture or whatever. There's also another point of view that says, well, what about the fact that cultures are often imposed from the top down? Like I was talking about Christianity earlier, some people would argue, well, the reason Christianity is the world's most popular religion is because it was, you had so many conversions at the point of a sword. During the era of colonialism, you had the Spanish and British and French and other empires going out and basically telling all of these people in these other animistic or pagan societies, well, you will be Christian now, or else we're gonna, we got a sword waiting for you. So that would be more like the idea.
But it does seem like it's coming top. I get that echo again. That's kind of cool, though, right? Okay, so it sounds like I'm talking into a canyon, so I kind of like it. I'm like a Hulk Grand Canyon type of thing. But I think it's top down. And I'm just looking at kind of this recent thing where I see the elites they're liquidating dissent in politics and society. And I don't see that coming from, the bottom up. And I think I remember hearing one of your discussions where you discussed kind of polls that were taken and how many people within our, people operating system are in agreement with kind of some of these woke ideologies and some of its kind of component pieces such as immigration and some other types of things. But so I see that it's not the ground up that's liquidating dissent within its ranks. It's really the elites that are liquidating dissent in politics and society, and they're kind of funhouse mirroring, and they're reimagining dissenters into threats to democracy. And instead, they're kind of lifting the elite oppressors themselves into the guardians of democracy.
Well, previously, I wasn't talking just about repression and dissent. I was talking more just about cultural evolution on a more general level. But as far as the issue of what you're talking about, there was an interesting study that was done by a British organization a couple of years ago, probably, I'd say 3 years ago, maybe, where they examined the culture wars in the United States. And this is an organization, I think they're called More in Common. But they examined political and social conflict all over the world in different societies, and they were examining political conflict in the United States. And they identified what they called 7 tribes, 7 basic political tribes in the United States. And basically, there was what they call conservative and very conservative. And these are basically the red tribe, what I called earlier the red tribe, which is about 1/3 of the country, at least as far as the breakdown that they had. And then they had what they call moderates, and then the politically disengaged, and then people who were passive liberals or just traditional liberals. And then the final tribe was a group they called progressive activists. And this is basically the politically correct crowd. And what they found was that the progressive activists, that is the politically correct, the social justice warriors, the woke or whatever, are actually a very small number of people. They're actually, maybe, 8% of the U.S. population at the most. But here's the key issue. Those people tend to be concentrated in what I was describing before, which is the knowledge industries, the ideas industries. So even though they're small in number, they have a big mouth, and they also have a platform. All right. So these are the people who actually run the media, the educational system, the universities, mainline religion, as well as many corporate sectors, things particularly in marketing, advertising, human resources, management, all of these different kinds of fields. I'm starting to see this kind of stuff in the healthcare industry now. All kinds of things. If you go to college today and major in business at a business school, you will be instructed in how to have a socially responsible corporation and how you can use.
But there is no such thing. Can I tell you something? I have friends that are part of the G20 summits. They actually wrote up some of the preparation for it and for the Davos, and forget about they're big up there. But it's really interesting because they started talking to me about this 3 years ago, and there's almost a tongue-in-cheek quality to it because they genuinely don't believe it themselves. I mean,
well, sure. I mean, there were plenty of Soviet commissars that didn't believe in their ideology as well. I mean, I'm sure there were plenty of people in Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda that didn't
really believe this within your communities and within everybody else's community here. And there's a question here. I'm going to put it up so we can be responsive to it in a moment. But within your communities that you regularly interact with, and particularly within kind of the anarchist community and your friends within Antifa and kind of the whatever it is, just kind of consortium of dissenters, and like yourself, more kind of well-read ones, so that they can articulate their positions rather than spray paint it, right? So it's just kind of really interesting. Do they genuinely believe that there is such a thing as this social capitalism that has its limitations, and anything above the excess mortality they give back?
Well, you've actually asked several questions in one.
I asked a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah. When it comes to woke people, all right, people who embrace this politically correct ideology, and they'll make a big show of their support for Black Lives Matter, and they make sure they've got when Pride Month comes up, they make sure they give the proper salute and that kind of thing, and all the stuff, and then they're green conscious and all this kind of stuff. All right, you've got different categories of people who buy into that. All right, you've got some people who are sincere, right, who believe that they're fighting against social injustice or fighting for the environment or fighting for disadvantaged or marginalized people. You have people for whom this is a type of moral panic. I would say that they're kind of, we could compare them to mothers against drunk driving. Back in the 1980s, there was a big moral panic about drunk driving. Now, drunk driving really exists, and it really is a problem.
They're actually a good organization. Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. You're just kind of using it as a catch-all. It actually is a very thoughtful organization. When do you say that, Nancy?
Yeah.
Just beautiful people. Beautiful people.
Okay. Yeah.
But, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
All right, we could use plenty of other examples. We could, it could be, satanic rock, or in the 1950s, they thought comic books were causing juvenile delinquency or something. But you have moral panickers, sometimes a moral panic can be in response to something that's legitimate. Sometimes it can be a response to something that's more dubious. Another example was the moral panic about terrorism after September 11th. Well, September 11th really happened, and terrorism really does exist. All right, but you do have a moral panic built up around terrorism as well. So you have well-meaning do-gooders, you have moral panickers, you have people that I think this kind of stuff functions as a type of religion. A lot of social justice-y people that I've come across, they could just as easily be one of these Mormons knocking on your door on Saturday afternoon. Do you love Jesus or whatever? They could, you have that kind of psychology. You also have people for whom I think this is an expression of some kind of personal pathology. They feel that being attached to this, I am the social justice warrior fighting for the oppressed, that makes them important somehow.
Within the leadership of those, I know a lot of political activists, right? They were with Obama, they were with this or that, and I genuinely like them. Just so you understand, but we have a more candid conversation than they would ever have outside of our dinners. And they'll tell you, look, I'm just using this as a lever. This is what we're really trying to do. We're just trying to operate within this, and we have to deal with reality. And
right. Well, okay, that gets to some of my some of my other categories. Right. Like I said, there's do-gooders, there's moral panickers, there's religious believers, there's people for whom this is some kind of personal pathology. There's also ladder climbers, virtue signalers, just like today they will affirm their belief in social justice and green consciousness and Pride Month and Black Lives Matter, the same way they would affirm, traditional family values and anti-communism in the 1950s or something like that. but it's all just a status thing. They want to be a respectable member of society because there's benefits in that for them. You also have power elite elements who are co-opting this. Who you have, one thing the Marxists get right is when they talk about how in a society you have the base and the superstructure. The material base is actually the distribution of wealth and power in the society. The superstructure is the ideological framework that's used to legitimize that. And that can be anything. It can be, the Third Reich, or the Führer principle. It can be the traditional American civil religion. It can be the divine right of kings, or it can be, the idea that, well, the state is good because it's the state that upholds civil rights and wants to have environmental cleanups and gives gay people the right to marry and upholds the melting pot and all these kinds of more progressive sounding ideas. All right, so you have those who are trying to make this as part of the legitimating ideological superstructure of the state. You also have genuinely dangerous people, and that is pathological power seekers who just see this as an instrument of political self-advancement and political control. They're comparable to, say, the Red Guards of the Maoist China from the 1960s or something like that. And there are people like that in our society who are influential, who are recognized individuals who I think have a mentality that's very similar to that. So you have all of these different kinds of categories, but collectively, those who think this way are actually fairly small in number. They tend to be concentrated in the elite. They tend to be concentrated in, I would say among affluent and professional class people and more well-off people, they tend to be, they tend to be concentrated in those sectors, particularly in the knowledge industry sectors. Now, what is very interesting, you're talking about the anarchists and the Antifa and all that. What's interesting is that you have a subset of anarchists, and probably most of the viewers know who they are. They're these kids with black masks and black flags, and they're out setting garbage cans on fire and spray painting graffiti everywhere, these Antifa-type anarchists. You have a subset of anarchists that is actually...
This is Jack. Can I tell you? I was telling you about this right before. The Jack Posobiec actually, because I'm fascinated by Antifa. Jack Posobiec actually infiltrated them. I'm fascinated because of their technological operations, how they're kind of managing their infrastructure, and ideologically how they're organizing in very advanced type of ways. Even their communications infrastructure is really advanced, and how they're getting all these new recruits. I'm fascinated by it. I apologize. I just had to throw that in.
In a sociological sense, what they are is predominantly a youth subculture that is drawn from the social strata that I just described. Many of these people are relatively young. They're either students, or they work in the university system, or they work for NGOs and institutions like that. And they have this kind of cult ideology, this Antifa ideology. And what this ideology is a friend of mine once described it as a Plato's forms version of the woke ideology. Like in Plato, for those who aren't familiar with Plato, you've got the idea, well, there's an idea, and then there's like the perfection of that idea. Like ideas are like are emanations of some sort of perfect ultimate version of the idea. And a lot of these Antifa people, that's what they are. They're sort of like this Plato's forms version of wokeness, the political correctness.
Are they aware of it? Do they have that awareness within themselves that that this is something that they kind of seek, or is it just they're kind of floating around and it's just a convenience for them to pick up this ideology?
Well, I think for individuals there's a range of motivations, but I think in a social context, what's happening is you have this subset of anarchists who think that they are being edgy. They think that they are being anti-establishment. But in reality, what they've done is absorb and internalize the value system that they've gotten from the system. They've internalized the value system that they've gotten from the media, from the entertainment industry, from the educational system, from the university system. Many of them were raised with this ideology by their parents, depending on their background. So they're simply, again, an analogy can be made to the Red Guards, right? The Red Guards in Maoist China, what were they? I'm sure those kids thought of themselves as being, we are revolutionaries, we're progressive, we're enlightened, we're against the establishment. In reality, they were just the thugs of the head of state. They were just his, basically his henchmen, trying to eliminate the Mao's opponents through sicking these crazy kids on them. And I think that's the role that the Antifa types serve in our own society. There's this rising ruling class, this rising affluent class that has this kind of woke ideology for various reasons. I mean, varying degrees of sincerity, but there's all kinds of personality types that get drawn into that. But I think that the Antifa types are sort of like, like I said, it's sort of like a parody version of it. But they don't understand that. They think that they are being edgy because they've absorbed this idea that, well, to be fanatically, pathologically anti-racist is what it means to be anti-establishment or anti-authority and that kind of thing. In reality, racism is probably at an all-time low in our society today. But that's just one of many examples. So I think that's what's going on there. And I think this is, because I am personally interested in anarchism, I think it's really interesting that you have this subset of anarchists that takes this establishment ideology and internalizes it, pathologizes it, and does make it into this kind of Plato's form type of variation of that ideology in a way that's just sort of comical when you watch it as an as an observer, as an outsider looking in who doesn't take any of this seriously. You watch this and you think, well, that's so silly. I mean, it's like these people are like just parroting what their freshman 101 social science professors told them or whatever. I mean, I teach social science classes myself. I know all the intellectual arguments for all these points of view.
Where do you teach? Where do you teach?
I'm not going to say. I'm not going to say.
Okay. Because you're awesome. You're awesome. You definitely should be teaching. You've got a very thoughtful and instructive quality. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, I keep that aspect of my life separate from this, but But yeah, so you do have this, in fact, the reason that I became so interested in this stuff is about 20 years ago, maybe a little longer, I started to notice that this wokeness, as it's now called, it wasn't called that then, but as it's now called, was a rising force in society. And I viewed it as a potentially dangerous force. I viewed it as this kind of rising authoritarianism. And I started to notice that it was being adopted more and more by elites as part of their self-legitimating ideological superstructure. Now that older ideas like, say, organized religion and that kind of thing are losing power and influence. And at the same time, parallel to that, I started noticing that there was this subset of anarchists, these anarchist subcultures, that were actually adopting the same framework and doing so in a way that's very, self-parodying. I was really fascinated by that as a social phenomena, and that is why I've, spend so much time on this, as a matter of interest over time. But I think that's what's going on with these Antifa people. I mean, these are people who, there are people who want. Well, here's another analogy. When I was a kid, I used to like to go to professional wrestling matches. And this was back in the 1970s when the promoters of professional wrestling would actually try to make you believe that this was a real contest. Nowadays they admit it's just entertainment, it's just a show. But back then they had what was called kayfabe, which meant that, you got to make the fans believe this is real. And a lot of the fans did believe it was real. If you went to a live wrestling match back then, I would say easily half the fans thought it was real. Maybe another quarter wasn't sure, So, it was treated as a real sporting contest. And what would happen, and I used to see this all the time, at live wrestling matches, you'd have a fan favorite, like a babyface character, a fan favorite character, Ricky Steamboat, pretty boy type of guy or something. He's the one everybody cheers for because he's the good guy. So in the ring, he's getting worked over by a group of heel characters, these, villainous characters, like this, there was one named Baron von Raschke.
My role in wrestling would be like I'm the innocent bystander that just walks by the ring and gets hit with the chair, and that's my role. There's the good guy, there's the bad guy, and then there's the innocent bystander that gets hurt. That would be me.
Well, what would happen is that in live matches, you would actually see, babyface characters getting worked over by these heel characters, these villains, and you had all these fans in the audience that think this is real. So you would get fans who would try to crawl up in the ring and fight the heel characters because they want to help out their hero who's getting his ass, supposedly getting beaten up in the ring, And I used to see, cops and bouncers carry fans out of sports arenas all the time for trying to do stuff like this. And the Antifa remind me of that. They remind me of people who, it's like instead of watching wrestling every week and thinking it's real, and then they want to go fight at the wrestling match, they watch MSNBC and Rachel Maddow and think that's real, and then they want to go out and fight, in the street because, Donald Trump is a fascist and he's really Hitler and, he's working for the Russians who are trying to, who are leading a global fascist conspiracy or something like that. I think that's really the kind of psychology that they have. So that's like I said, I do find this very interesting from a sociological perspective.
I find it fascinating. I like that echo. I don't think the echo. Nancy, you hear that, right? Interesting, right? It's an interesting effect. I hear the echo. You heard me say almost. I hear everything twice. That's awesome. So I'm also very interested in this phenomenon, and you and I were discussing it offline because it's we were discussing Noam Chomsky, right? We both have read a lot of Noam Chomsky. I'm sure we both read a lot of Chris Hedges, Cornel West, and that that kind of theological and intellectual left, right? It's really interesting, and I've met all of them too. So I haven't met Noam, no, but I'm fascinated by it because I look at propaganda as having moved from this kind of, into kind of like a Mesolithic type of period, far beyond where it was described as earlier. We've had 20 years of venture capital, private equity, and Google's investing in behavioral sciences. And it's just so interesting to me that just as I don't even try and persuade people about anything with COVID or anything about with the fastest roll of power in history and anything about kind of the delusions of Russiagate and now January 6th or any of these type of things, because I found that it's always kind of apparetic. There's just no way there's no pursuit of truth because we both have a different truth. And I can't blame them for having a different truth than me anymore. I mean, is that something that you find within Antifa as well?
Well, I think that points to something that we see all over the place today. You mentioned Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is most well known. One of the things he's most well known for is he wrote the book Manufacturing Consent. And what he was basically describing is how systems of propaganda work in modern, ostensibly liberal democratic societies. Not the crude, Joseph Goebbels model of propaganda, but the how propaganda works in a society like the United States as it was during the Cold War period. And he explored the roots of the PR industry. He went back and examined the thought of people like Edward Bernays and people who developed the whole concept of PR and advertising as a form of propaganda, throughout the 20th century. And I think that model applied very much to the post-war model of propaganda. You and I are probably roughly the same age. So we both grew up when the Cold War was still going on, and we can probably both remember the time period in which there were really only 3 major channels on television, and you had the news programs at 6:30 in the evening, Walter Cronkite and people like that, and they all pretty much said the same thing, and they all pretty much presented the news in the same way from this kind of seemingly sterile kind of middle of the road, certainly pro-American and all that type of perspective, but in a way that actually kind of shied away from controversy. Now what we see though is something that's totally the totally opposite model. And a lot of things I think have caused this. I think technological change, I think social and cultural change, alternative business models have been developed, all sorts of things have happened to cause this. But now we see it going in the opposite direction, where when it comes to propaganda, it's all about fueling antagonism. Like Matt Taibbi has a book called Hate Incorporated, and he talks about how the media along the way, particularly cable news channels and also talk radio and also televangelism from the right and all kinds of things, all of them develop this model of propaganda that is about fueling hatred. It's about fueling hostility towards other people. And if you watch MSNBC today, if you watch Fox News today, if you listen to talk radio, if you listen to, watch the equivalent of that from the left, that's what it's about. It's all about fueling hostility towards the enemy.
I got a theory for that. But we're going to get to some questions. Because there is some here, and they've been so patient. They've been so kind. But we're going to get to that because I got a theory. It's really good. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Very difficult for me to kind of cross the transom to get it from my head to paper, but I'm trying to do it. So Mitchie C123, what's that character's name from the Fight Club? Keith, you're an anarchist. What's the name of that character?
I've never seen it. That's
from
one of
Brad Pitt from the Fight Club.
Yeah, I've never seen that movie. I've never seen the Fight Club.
Oh, he was an anarchist. You got to see that thing. It's awesome. I feel like that guy. I'm watching the world burn down.
Seen the Fight Club, yeah.
It's awesome. The book is only 100,000 words. It's amazing that somebody could put in that much quality and elegance and economy into such a great book. So Mitchie C123 says, thoughts on the politics of obedience, the discourse of voluntary servitude by, and I'll let you do the French because I'm going to mispronounce it.
Etienne de la Bataille, I believe is how you pronounce that. That's a classic work. It was written during the Renaissance. And it basically argues that the only thing that keeps rulers in power is because so many people voluntarily comply with their edicts. And what would happen if everybody just said, well, sorry, we don't care if you call yourself the king or not. We're just not going to listen to you. And that is, we see plenty of examples historically where ruling classes or states or whatever have been brought down in precisely that way. The modern example that I think is the most significant is what happened in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991. If we remember the end of the Cold War, we had this vast communist expanse that included the Soviet Union, which was itself a massive territory, and then there are satellite states in the Warsaw Pact countries in Eastern Europe, and then they also had there was also communist Yugoslavia, which itself was they had a falling out with the Soviet Union, but they were itself a collection of countries that were sort of a federation. You had this vast communist expanse that included dozens of individual countries, and yet in the space of a couple of years, every one of these states collapsed. And with the exception of Yugoslavia, it was relatively peaceful. There's relatively limited amount of bloodshed. And why was that? The big question is, why did that happen? And the reason why is because the state lost legitimacy to the point that nobody recognized it anymore. There's one of the classic examples of this is there's the video of Nicolae Ceausescu's last speech. Nicolae Ceausescu was the dictator of communist Romania. And his last speech, you can find this on YouTube. He goes out on the balcony in classic, 20th century dictator form, and he's making a speech, and he's saying, "I promise you this, that, and the other thing." And then all of a sudden, the people start booing him and flipping him off or whatever. And he's just stunned by this. He's like, "This doesn't happen. This just doesn't happen. What's going on here?" And then he leaves the balcony, and he's seen off somewhere conferring with somebody else, like, what's going on here? Then he comes back out and tries again. He tries to resume this speech, and the same thing happens, and he just can't believe it. The people are booing me, the people are telling me to whatever off, and of course he was executed on television a few days later. But what happened was that system had lost legitimacy to the point that nobody cooperated with it anymore. The leaders of those countries, they would send out the army to fight, and the army would just be like, "We don't care about this. What did you ever do for us?" They'd send the police out to arrest people. The police are like, "We don't care. You haven't done anything for us either." So it's and that's what the essay, the classic essay that the question is about, refers to. It refers to this idea that rulers can only stay in power through the cooperation of the majority of their subjects. And when a ruler loses legitimacy to the point that the subjects just don't take them seriously, then the ruler is finished. I mean, that's what's going to bring down the Kim regime in North Korea eventually.
But do you see that happening? Do you see that happening here? And I'm not, obviously, I can't qualify or disqualify the Biden administration or kind of the legitimacy of it or Trump or anything else, because I'm really more focused on kind of the system rather than just its kind of the top hat on the monopoly board. I am really interested in that and kind of this fastest roll up of power in history. But but Biden, there just doesn't seem any way for the media, from what I've seen, and I really catalog all of this, to present them with a lot of legitimacy. It just seems like everything falls apart. And I don't mean there's any instances with them trying to give them some type of a heliography, an endless amount of that, or give them any type of, they always attribute to him some type of biblical references, things that you probably don't know, but I kind of study all this. They'll always use words that are associated with some type of a monumentalization of religion, or sometimes it's a monumentalization of science. Nevertheless, they cannot give him any type of authority as the president unless you're really a real adherent. He just can't. He doesn't. They can't give him that type of a property.
Well, I'd go further than that. From what I've seen, the way that the media has treated Biden is it's kind of like something you would see in North Korea. I mean, recently there was a video that was released of Biden was eating an ice cream cone, and the reporters are all, what ice cream are you eating? Dear leader.
I downloaded that. I hard copied that. I called that.
Well, there was another one. There was another one where he's driving off in a car or something like that. It's like, and they're all about what kind of car is this? Dear leader. It's well, there was that press conference he did. Where he looked like he was probably pumped up with B12 or something before he was sent out to the podium. And then he's got that little directory that he's holding where he's got the faces of all the reporters who were supposed to ask questions on his little chart. And then he calls on them one by one, and then they ask him some softball questions like, should we be kind to puppy dogs or something, and it's I mean, the media has been more sycophantic regarding Joe Biden than any political leader I've ever seen. And the thing is, it's not because they like him. All right. It's not because they even take him seriously. I think that this is being engineered from the top in the sense that this is, when Joe Biden was running for the presidency, what I was saying at the time was that if he got elected, what we would see is this. We would see the power elite in the United States trying to create what I call a ruling class unity regime. Because what is happening is the wider society is fragmenting. I would argue that the cultural conflict we now see, whether it's the red tribe and the blue tribe, and then after last summer, we also see a rising underclass as well. All of that conflict is becoming very similar to the kinds of things that you see in the Middle East. It's becoming very similar to the Sunni-Shia battle in Iraq and places like that, or the sectarian divisions that existed in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. I mean, it's not quite on that level yet in terms of level of intensity, but it's the same kind of dynamic that's being played out. And I think that the power elite in the United States are very concerned about losing the grip. I think that if you look at who was the Biden coalition, the basic line was, we just got to get rid of Orange Man no matter what. And what they essentially put together is what I call the New Popular Front. That is, for those who don't know what the Popular Front was, back in World War II, in the lead up to World War II, Joseph Stalin ordered all of the fraternal communist parties of Europe to put aside the idea of revolution and things like that and form a united front against quote unquote fascism. Well, they really did have fascism back then. In the name of defeating that first. So the idea is we're going to, the communists were supposed to create a popular front with liberals and centrists and social democrats and all of that. All right, so so I use that as an analogy. I'll say that the Biden administration is like this ruling class unity regime, where they're trying to put together this new popular front that includes neocons and never Trumpers and
yeah. But here's what I noticed. And I'm going to show you that clip. I'm telling you, I download everything. You know why? I hear that echo. I hear that echo.
Tyler Durden.
What? Tyler Durden. I hear that echo. I like that echo. Now I'm getting hooked on it. Keep it up. Okay. So I download all these because these things always disappear. The ice cream thing will stay forever. But a lot of the links that I've downloaded about certain things that people have said and hard copies get disappeared. It's amazing. I want to show you this. Watch this.
Mr. President, what did you
Chocolate chip.
Oh, yeah. Chocolate chip. What is your message? Mr.
That's awesome, right? Chocolate chip. But so I understand, and thank you, Mitchie, for that. Nancy says Tyler Durden, so thank you. That's awesome. But so I understand all that, but I'm just so fascinated by it because, again, to their point and what you were saying earlier, I don't see a way for them to, I had Darren Beatty. I don't know if you know Darren. You should. You guys are like awesome. And he was discussing Hobbes and kind of the legitimacy of this is all above my head, right? The legitimacy of a regime, right? Mm-hmm. And how people kind of have to abide by it or not, whatever it is, whatever Hobbes is, right? So, but there's just no way that I see, because I look at all this imagery, that with rising inflation, what it is, with social unrest, with wokeism disrupting kind of the social fabrics that people need, particularly within an immigrant community. This is in Germany, where they're kind of distinguishing between kind of the indigenous population and that which is coming over recently. Everybody in America is an immigrant. So, it's really disruptive what they're doing because they're attacking the immigrants as much as they're attacking the whites. I don't see a way that they can give Biden that legitimacy, not because of the way in which he got elected or didn't, or any of the controversies, because that's a different story, but in terms of his relationship to the people he serves. There just doesn't seem to be any type of a relationship between the two.
Yeah, well, I think that's the crux of the issue, in the sense that we have, like I said, our society's fragmenting into these warring tribal sectarian groups who really don't agree on anything, who view each other as existential enemies. And increasingly, none of the tribes that are fighting with each other view the existing system as legitimate. They may hate each other more, but increasingly, though, you have a system that's it's fragmenting and losing legitimacy. And the powers that be know that. I mean, they know that they're losing legitimacy. They're concerned about losing their grip. That's one of the reasons why they've started talking about bringing anti-terrorism laws to, like the war on terror, to domestic terrorism, so to speak. That's why I think, like I said, they've been trying to create this ruling class unity regime with Joe Biden. Joe Biden is basically like a ventriloquist dummy. I mean, it's kind of like,
I said that. I've said that. That's my thing.
Well, it's like this.
Thing. I got a trademark on that. That's my thing. He's a ventriloquist dummy.
That's good. But all right, it's kind of like, let's say when Lenin died in 1924, if the Soviets had, when they stuffed him, let's say instead of just stuffing him, they had made a ventriloquist dummy out of him and tried to make him into the permanent, ruler or whatever.
Here's a crazy question, because you study this stuff, and there's a lot of questions here, so I want to get to them. I'm going to ask you this question, then I'm going to get to the other questions. Is the thing, I went on Cotto Godfrey, and they were very disbelieving of me at that time, because this was in September, and I said, Biden's going to win, it's going to be a home run, slam dunk, it's going to be one of the biggest blowouts in American history, whatever. They need to give him a mandate, they need to present him as FDR. Just very interesting. The way they've instrumentalized elections is very interesting to me as well. But actually, I'm going to get to the question now because I see it coming up here, and then I'm going to go backwards to it. I don't see them having a way to legitimize Biden. And do you see that? So I saw that they had such a failure to legitimize him even as a candidate. Even as a candidate, he had no way of being legitimized. That the pitch, the way I understood it as a big Democrat, a big dollar Democrat that I am, is that they said, look, the corporations are going to be taking charge. Trust them. Don't worry about Biden. Trust the big corporations. Trust Amazon, because Amazon can run your government better. And just Amazon is going to win by attrition. So forget about Biden. He's like a placeholder. Just vote for him because it's really Amazon. It's really Google. Trust them. That was my take on it.
Well, I think when it comes to the elite class, like the donor class and all of that, which, you know, I mean, I know you travel in investor circles and all that, so I imagine you probably encountered a lot of that. I do think that was the idea there. Now, when it came to marketing the candidate on a wider level, first of all, they tried to keep Biden out of the public eye as much as possible. And they basically just ran a purely negative campaign in the sense
but
of...
people tolerated that. They tolerated not seeing Biden.
Yeah. Well, because I think a lot of it is that our politics today is so tribal and so partisan. People are just going to vote for their tribe no matter who the candidate is or what they do. And you see that in a lot of countries. I mean, in a lot of countries where you have huge sectarian tribal divisions, people vote with their tribe or their sect. It doesn't matter who the candidate is. It doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter what the proposed policies are. It doesn't matter how personally competent the individual is. It's just you vote for your team because it's your team, period. And that's what I saw going on with Biden. Well, it was true with the other side too. But what I saw going on with Biden was it wasn't about the candidate. You know, who cares who the candidate is? You know, the election was about, we got to get rid of Orange Man. Oh, and by the way, you know, under our rule, it'll be a nice America where everybody gets along. You know, and that's really the sum total of their message. They didn't propose any policies. They didn't propose any really any ideas at all. It was just all about, don't vote for that guy.
But the thing is, what they do when they do that is, because these are behavioral sciences, they're making people complicit. And once those people are complicit, they understand that they have a responsibility as a link in a chain to not allow it to break. And so their complicity just has to keep on increasing. But I want to get to this question. It's so fascinating to me. Rising Serpent, where do you see, thank you so much for joining us, namaste. Where do you see Curtis Yarvin and Michael Malice ideologically speaking on the anarchist spectrum? And I don't know who Curtis Yarvin is.
That's Mencius Mollberg. He writes that's the guy that writes under the name Mencius Mollberg, the neo-reactionaries. Well, I'm familiar with these two individuals. Michael Malice, it claims to be an anarchist. From what I've seen of his work, he's sort of in the anarcho-capitalist free market anarchist framework. He tends to cite Ayn Rand as an influence. Ayn Rand didn't claim to be an anarchist, but you know, he's interesting because he's had a similar life experience to Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand grew up in the Soviet Union and, you know, became a proponent of ultra-capitalism, ultra-individualism, you know, in her philosophy. Michael seems to have gone a similar way. He was born in the Soviet Union, and he seems to follow that same kind of life trajectory as Ayn Rand, although I think he's a more interesting personality than Ayn Rand. But so he's sort of in the camp of what's called the free market anarchist or the anarcho-capitalist. Curtis Yarvin, or Mencius Mollberg, as he writes, this is the name he writes under, he seems fairly similar to the anarcho-capitalist as well, although he puts a greater emphasis on the idea of the competent leader. You know, from what I gather, Curtis Yarvin's model would be something kind of like privatized cities that are run by oligarchs or plutocrats, you know, kind of like a business, you know, like instead of having a government, you know, you have let's say a city or community that's run like a company, almost like a company town type of model, you know, which from an anarchist perspective, I see problems with that because, you know, the historical track record of that isn't very good. But yeah, I'd say those guys, both of those guys, particularly Curtis, I say on the more rightward end of the anarchist spectrum. You know, the Antifa like the far left end of the anarchist spectrum.
Yeah, see, I didn't know that's what Mencius Mollberg. I've heard the name because I saw him on Jack Murphy in what turned out to be a debate versus Michael Anton. I'm a huge Michael Anton fan, so I guess I'm tribal. So that's the tribe that I picked, and I'm a huge fan of his. But if that's his thesis on what I call corporations becoming countries and kind of the privatizations of cities and how it revolves itself, he is disastrously wrong. And I've seen people like Balaji and a whole bunch of other kind of venture capitalists talk about this and the decentralization of cities as though it's something desirable when they're completely wrong. They just don't have any sense of places where these systems are in place currently, although they might take different forms. I mean, just going back to China, in China, there's a central government, right, that controls the major decisions. And but since there was economic reforms, 25, 30 years ago now, China implemented a system in which provincial governments have contracts with the central government. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, where
The SEC, are you talking about the SECs, the special economic zones?
no,
like,
no,
like
no.
Shanghai
The
and all
special
that?
economic zones are something quite different. The special economic zones are in Pakistan and such, are places that are kind of selected for a significant amount of investment and commerce. And as such, there's there's a certain amount of give and take that has to happen. It's a whole different thing. I could discuss that all day. But in China, China enacted these economic reforms, right? Began in the 70s, and they have the CCP system, right? The Chinese Communist Party system, which is, and the provincial governments, which are these smaller regional type of things, then have contracts with the central government, right? So written agreement for the total amount of share of taxes and profit revenues that have to be remitted. And the provincial governments keep the rest. So that creates a horrible situation. And I could, go down to the amount of corruption that type of a fragmentation causes. And I can also say that it creates another issue where it's very difficult to find truth. So if you take a look at it within a political operating system, how something like that currently is implemented and works, is within a kind of a defederalized, federalized system, which something would have to be where there's a dual or triple sovereignty type of thing, where you have cities that are kind of chartered and contracted, where they, just like in Roman times, they get kind of they're told what their tax allocation, what their harvest has to be, and anything above that harvest, they get to keep for themselves. And if they don't meet that quota, then they get beat in the head, right? Because that's that system. But it creates a tremendous amount of corruption, tremendous amount of fraud. And in the Chinese Communist Party, which has 400 million Marxists, in China, which has 400 million Marxists, their form of capitalism is cheating the Chinese Communist Party. And so you also get a problem where it's very difficult to find truth, where you have industrial accidents and the cities, horrible industrial accidents where thousands of people will die, and the cities don't want to divulge it to their own citizenry because they don't want to have to pay the money and the fines and all the cleanups, which are extraordinarily expensive. And then you get cities robbing from each other, and I would have to get into that, and that's difficult. And they're also probably not familiar with kind of the history of how it's been rolled out in the United States with kind of the company towns that have happened here, the company towns that have happened in India, company towns that have happened in Mexico. They all end, except in India, they all end very disastrously, because no matter how benevolent that dictatorship is going to be, ultimately there's a point where they have to kind of adjust their own economics, and there's enormous human consequences, and they always end in violence, because these people who spent the last 10, 15, 20 years and raised their kids on these company towns that have survived on script notes to go into the company stores with. There's a big problem in Mexico. All of a sudden, those script notes get turned off. They've got no money. They've got no assets. They have nothing to live for. They're angry. It's a disastrous system. I didn't know that was kind of the ambition he strives for. That's interesting.
That's how I interpret it. I'm not an expert on Yarvin's work, but from what I've read of it, that's how it sounds. It sort of sounds like the idea, this kind of benevolent dictator idea. Well, I think places like Singapore and Dubai are often touted by these neo-reactionaries or whatever as model states as well. That is rather small states that are sort of run as almost like smart cities or something like that.
There's no such thing, because what happens is, in order for and I don't want to get into it too much, but what happens is you still have to have some type of ownership, right? No matter where that ownership is assigned from, it could be charter or however, I don't see charters particularly, but it could be something of that type. And then you have a local government, which kind of still has responsibility for executing kind of the mandates that are cascaded down to it, the rules and decisions that are cascaded from its upper tier. And then you've got an additional problem of transferring information from the top down and then from the bottom up. And then also in terms of decision making, we're talking about extremely tremendous amount of complexities and interweb relationships. And it's like a decision-making pyramid. Very complex, requires reporting at each level with, in that instance, you're going to have compounding points of failure. And then what also happens within that is the citizens, and you're beginning to see this a lot in the United States, in Flint, Michigan, where Democrats had a tremendous amount of corruption within the water system there, and how the federal dollars have been spent. It's just horrible. They've used racism as a way of kind of escaping any type of accountability. But so in systems like that, and you're beginning to see it here, the citizens have no effective monitoring system, by which they can supervise the behavior of the local government, right? You've got to take that away. So it means you're going to wind up enduring, and I don't discuss this with Balaji as a venture capitalist, he's completely wrong about this, but they have to endure territorialism, departmentalism, which is something you were talking about earlier in terms of the building up of the bureaucracy here, and then the fragmentation of authoritarianism. And
I'm slightly familiar with the systems you're describing, but to me they seem more like feudalism. They seem like they seem like an industrialized feudalism in a way. I mean, I'm using feudalism as sort of a metaphor, but in the sense that they basically create these fiefdoms, these localized fiefdoms that are still subordinated to this overarching metastructure. That's their system. I don't think that has anything to do with anarchism, but
it's about as un-anarchic.
What's that?
It's about actually if there's such a thing as a non-anarchic system, it's about as non-anarchic as a system could ever get to. And I could really go into it, and I'll just give you a case in point because I was very involved in it. Several years ago in China, there was a horrible earthquake in Sichuan, and I guess about 100,000 people died. There was millions of people that were homeless, and millions of people were also giving money throughout the whole world to help them out. Governments were throughout the whole world were giving. I mean, this was a real human disaster, and there was about $12 billion, which is a lot of money. This is just off the top of my head, that of goods and services that were donated to the victims themselves after it was a 2008 quake, and then they did forensics. A few years later, some journalists who in China, which are real dissidents as well, and have to take your theory and then operate on your theory within that environment, within a very hostile regime, right? So in 2009, the researchers started doing forensics, and it was discovered that 80% or so of the donations after the earthquake were funneled into the Chinese, what you would think of as little fiefdoms, right? Mm-hmm. And it was counted as extra revenue. That was the line item that they gave it, was extra revenue. It happens all the time. It happened with the disaster that they had there in Guangdong with the waterway. I mean, it happens all the time. The big factory fires. Those systems do not work. They are not feudal systems. There's no Medici family, that's out there with that benevolence and that love of their people. These are hostile regimes that are trying to get as much distance from their people as they can.
Right. But it's still an overarching system of, essentially exploiting the peasants. It's
horribly exploiting them because they get no accountability. This is why in China, with the rewrite of the Constitution, which they just did a few years ago, they, you probably heard on TV and on the news that the Constitution extended the powers of the ruling regime, that they didn't have to run for re-election and they weren't going to be displaced within the dynastic system. So they extended their terms. But that was really nothing because everyone knew that she was going to stay forever, right? That's already given. Everybody knows that. The powers to strip people out of Hong Kong and extract them from Hong Kong and move them onto the mainland, prosecution, judicial system, which is disastrous. But everybody knew that that's been a regular thing. But what also happened there is the People's Congress was stripped of all of its power, and all that remains is this type of ceremonial appearances that they make every once in a while at the plenary. So what happens is you have all these millions of people starving because things are collapsing over there very badly, and they're going to continue to collapse, and they've got no representation whatsoever. So there's nobody, the person who's in charge, his job is not to help you. His job is to create social stability, which means to throw you in jail. It's a really different system. I didn't know that was something that is that something that Malice is in favor of also, that type of.
I don't know about Malice, but the ideas of the neo-reactionaries seem to fit this kind of model.
Wow.
This kind of
they don't live in reality.
Corporate governance model, yeah, and Mollberg is one of the big neo-reactionaries. I'm not an expert on that particular tendency, but that's how it's always seemed to me.
People who say that don't live in reality. They just don't live in reality. They've never seen it work. Our system here had so many checks and balances, they failed. Nevertheless, in terms of kind of the paperwork required to build a bureaucracy, we've done things that don't exist elsewhere in the world that I've traveled to. So Wizard Predicts, thank you so much for joining us. They've got an awesome website we'll talk about in a second. But Wizard Predicts says Antifa ideology is closer to state-sanctioned authoritarianism than anarchism.
Yeah.
I know we discussed it a bit before, but would you mind continuing with what you were describing, that relationship and how you saw it, 20 years ago, growing?
Yeah. Well, as I said, over time, I've seen this woke ideology, as it's now called, increasingly become part of the self-legitimating ideological superstructure of the state and the ruling class and all of that. And along with that, I've seen this new, I don't know how new it is, but this expanded professional managerial class. I've seen that class evolve as sort of like the arbiters of ideas in the wider society. And parallel to that, I think it's really interesting because you do have this subculture of anarchists that take all of that they get from various institutional sectors they've been exposed to, the media, the entertainment industry, the educational system. I think those are the big three. And then they've internalized all this, and then they've, and it's like they really believe this. They think that they are righteous warriors against a society that's just bursting at the seams with racism and sexism and homophobia and all these kinds of things. Even though modern societies are the most liberal societies that have ever existed, all of those kinds of things, these kinds of traditional out-group hostilities, while they haven't gone away completely, they're at an all-time low in terms of their overall influence. Now you can argue about, well, what about institutional racism and all that? Yeah, sure, but the idea that we live in a society that is if you listen to some of these people talk, the man from Mars who listened to these people talk would think that in the United States today the most powerful and influential organization is the KKK or something like that. That's just kind of the mindset they have. Like I've heard it said of the neocons, the neoconservatives, the war hawks, that for the neocons, it's always 1939 and there's always some new Hitler on the horizon. Well, for these Antifa people, it's always like, 1955 and there's always, the Ku Klux Klan or whatever is always on the horizon. They just kind of live in this world. And I think this is true of a lot of the political left in the United States generally. They live in this world where they're perpetually waging war against the America of the 1950s, as if that's the norm now. It's kind of like an analogy I've often used is it's like say you were a Soviet dissident, during the Cold War, say during the Khrushchev or Brezhnev era, and you're saying, well, what's really wrong with Russia today is the czar. These czarists just have too much influence, and we just got to get rid of these czarists. That's really the mindset that these people have. Which I think is ironically a very, kind of reactionary and retrograde philosophy. But I do think that you do have. It's very interesting that you have this subculture of anarchists and others with similar views that internalize this ideology in the way that they do. Is sort of a parody of this, wider woke ideology they've got from these other institutions, and they're just completely oblivious to this. They're like wrestling fans from the '70s who thought wrestling was real. That's really the kind of world they live in. It's the QAnon of the left. I call them the QAnon of the left.
QAnon is actually kind of a very left-wing type of thing. It's interesting. I knew nothing about QAnon. I did a Periscope with Chuck, who might still be here, and with John Robb, and I knew nothing about it before. And then I made a lot of inquiry into it. And it's an interesting phenomenon. I kind of see it being replayed in other instances where people need reality explained to them. And QAnon kind of took this fragmented reality, fragments of everything, and just created this kind of ad hoc reality. And it was very, very wild to watch people become adherents to it. So I want to extend Election Wiz's question and comment. And it's something you and I were discussing offline. So Election Wiz, again, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm a big fan of Election Wiz, and I now get a lot of their feed actually directly from Telegram. Are you on Telegram at all?
I'm not. No.
There's kind of a resilience to Telegram that I've really come to appreciate. I like the platform. I don't use it frequently. I only use it to take in information. I don't use it to kind of give back any. But I'm a big fan of Election Wiz. It's how I get my kind of news capsules, and it's electionwiz.com. But so one of the things you and I were discussing offline that I've really taken to heart, we were discussing that as well right before this began, is Antifa's notion. One of them is defund the police, and it's one of their kind of driving, mobilizing issues is to defund the police. And then you said something during our conversation that was so intriguing to me, and I emailed and texted it to a bunch of friends who are very well-known liberals, and they were like, yeah, he's 100% right. This is exactly what they want to do for exactly the reasons you said about kind of rolling up all those little agencies. So I think of Antifa, I think of defunding the police. Can you give me kind of a progression of how you see that, a kind of a sequence?
Okay, well, all right. In the last year or so, since the death of George Floyd, we've seen a series of riots or protests or whatever against policing, some of which are, take place for entirely valid reason. As an anarchist, I'm no fan of police, and I could go on and on and on about, criticisms I might have.
And I will tell you one thing. I'm going to interrupt for 1 second. My son lived out in that town. What was the name of that town? And he was stopped by the police regularly. Did you know? Yeah, and like where George Floyd was, he was stopped regularly by the police. And in Minnesota, where when he was going to school out there, stopped regularly by those police. So
yeah,
there's the Antifa definitely became interlopers in some very legitimate grievances. I just wanted to throw that in.
Well, I guess as part of my answer to your question, as far as the backstory to some of the problems with policing, I think that goes all the way back to the 1960s and 1970s. I think that the militarization of the police started back during the Nixon era. And I think that what it was about was when all the protests and riots and stuff like that happened in the 1960s during the Vietnam War era. They started to create a stronger federal police agencies. They started to create local SWAT teams. You started to see the federal government putting a lot of money into local police departments to build them up. And a lot of this was done under the cover of the war on drugs. I mean, I think that's what the war on drugs was in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It was a means of creating a domestic police state, essentially, for whose real purpose was to prevent, insurrections of the type that happened back in the 1960s. But that's sort of the backstory to how some of the problems with policing developed that we have today. But what happened, of course, as we know, is that George Floyd died. There was this wave of riots, protests, all this kind of thing, and then this idea of defund the police came out. Now, in theory, what defund the police is supposed to be is, well, we're not going to spend so much money on policing. We're going to cut police budgets. And we're going to spend more money on social services and things like that to try to reduce the causes of crime. The theory is, crime is not just about people doing bad things. There's also some problems like mental illness and drug addiction and homelessness and poverty and all these other kinds of things. So we have to have a more elaborate social service system that's going to try to deal with all of these things. And then we can, in the process, we can roll back the powers of the police and maybe not arrest as many people and all this kind of stuff. Now, the people who are more sincere about this, what they're trying to do is have something like the European system. I've spent time in Europe, and over there, policing is kind of done in such a way where it's not as aggressive as it is here. It depends on the country, but it's not as aggressive as it is here. And they do have much more extensive social services of the type that these people envision. So that's kind of what they're going for. Now, what's really going to happen is this, all right? There's not going to be a pullback of policing in, say, affluent, suburban areas and gated communities and wealthy areas. Those people like police. They want police, right? They, usually the more social status and wealth and stuff you have, the more you want to have your property protected, So, and the less likely you are to have direct conflict with the police. It does happen, but it's less likely. All right, so there's not going to be a pullback on policing in wealthy and affluent communities. There might very well be a pullback on policing in poor, inner city, predominantly minority communities. But the impact of that is going to be an increase in crime rates. You're going to start to see in poor urban communities, predominantly black or other minority communities, in many instances at least, you're going to see an increase in robberies, an increase in murders, an increase in gang activity and that kind of stuff. And we're going to start to see what happened in the 70s and 80s, where we had a spiral of crime rates. Crime rates spiraled in the 1970s and 1980s. There were a lot of reasons for that. The war on drugs, I think, was a big cause, a contributing factor to that. There were other things. You had a lot of people who were of crime age during that time period, and many other factors. We could talk about that all night. But I do think that what's going to happen is you're going to start to see, and we're already seeing it. We're already seeing a rise in crime rates. Now, as crime rates rise, there's going to be renewed calls for law and order. In the sense that people aren't going to just say, well, crime is great, no problem. I mean poor people don't believe that. Poor inner city minority people who may oppose police brutality, they don't just necessarily think crime should just run rampant. All right, so what will happen is, as crime starts to escalate, they'll have a renewed war on crime, and this is the angle they'll take. They'll say, look, we got to have law and order, no doubt about that. But we don't want to have the kind of traditional policing system that you have in the United States, where police are predominantly a local institution. In the United States, there's 18,000 different police forces. Local police departments, city, county, town, municipality, university campuses, Native American tribes. All these places have their own police forces. It's 18,000 police departments. In fact, I heard a cop once, a former cop turned criminal justice professor once say that in the United States, we couldn't have a police coup because there's too many police departments to ever have a unified coup against anything, So what's going to happen is all the do-gooders are going to come, supposedly are going to come along and say, well, we got to have law and order. We got to have policing. But the real problem is the police are racist. But why are the police racist? Well, it's because you have these localized police departments that are full of these uneducated, low IQ, redneck, moron, Derek Chauvin types. There's going to be these kinds. What we got to do is have a system of policing that doesn't have these kinds of people in it. Instead, what we have to have is a modernized, sophisticated police department of educated police officers, guys, men and women who've been through college and have master's degrees in social sciences and all of these, public administration, educated cops and diverse cops, not just these, rednecky white guys, but African Americans and every ethnicity and women and LGBTs and all that. We've got to have a diverse rainbow police force of educated, trained professionals, all of whom have been through through the university system and who believe in the woke ideology, and therefore they're not going to be racist. Right? But the only way we can do that is going to be if we nationalize the police department. We're not going to have these local police departments run by these redneck sheriffs and these local police academies where they spend 2 weeks on the firing range and then give somebody a gun and tell them to go play cop. We're going to have a national police force of trained, professional, and diverse police agents. Which basically means they're going to nationalize policing and create. Basically DHS is going to become the new police. That I see is the long-term goal. I mean, it's a perfect. If I were some person in the establishment seeking power and seeking to create a police state, I couldn't invent a more perfect plan, because it's like, hey, we're doing away with racist policing. We're doing away with incompetent, untrained policing. We're going to have an educated, professional police force that's diverse and has sensitivity training and cultural competence training and all these other things, and then we're going to have not only that, but we're going to have an army of social workers and social service professionals and CPS, CPS types, child protection services types. They're going to go out to all these disadvantaged poor communities and they're going to set everything straight. They're going to go out there and make sure all these folks, in these poor communities, that they've got just what they need. That they're making sure that all these, uneducated people are going to parenting class, and so they're going to try to micromanage the lower classes. I mean, progressivism, as it's practiced in the United States, has always been about that. It's always been primarily about micromanaging the undesirable classes. That's what Fabianism in Britain was about. So they're going to say, we're going to have this army of social workers to manage the the dangerous classes, but they obviously have to be backed up by policing at some point. So, we're not going to bother with these kinds of traditional, local, yokel, sheriff's departments and police departments. No, we're going to have this highly trained, specialized national police force. And I think that's the model of policing they're going to try to shift towards. So that ultimately, I think, is the direction that defund the police is going to be.
And so you see that as kind of like ideological.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
So you see it kind of as ideological enforcement.
Oh yeah, very much so. Very much so. I mean, we see it now. I mean, I know back when the incident in Ferguson happened, the police officer shot the guy Michael Brown. The story was the cop claimed Michael Brown attacked him and tried to take his gun. The other side of it was, no, he just shot Michael Brown in cold blood. I mean, who knows? Whatever happened, is whatever happened. But back then, there were calls for putting the Ferguson Police Department under the control of the Department of Justice. It's a problem that we have is this: a real political problem in the United States is that historically, concepts like states' rights and local control were often associated with racism. Like if you raise concepts like that to liberals, what do they always say? Oh yeah, that's what the slave owner said. That's what George Wallace said. So there's always been this idea, well, localism is just the right of local, backward, racist oligarchies to do what they want to do to minorities. And there's always been, along with that, this distrust of localized law enforcement. The image of a local law enforcement among liberals is some southern racist redneck cop or sheriff or something, Bull Connor or something like that. So in an ideological sense, from that perspective, it makes sense to say, oh well, we'll just have a national police force of educated professional people and a diverse police force. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the videos that the CIA has put out lately. Have you seen those Humans of the CIA videos? All right. I mean, that I think is going to be the model of the future, and they're going to do that with federal law enforcement as well. They're going to say, the ATF, the DEA, the FBI, the DHS, all these other federal alphabet soup agencies, which are basically just paramilitary police organizations. They're going to say, hey, we're diverse. We've got intersectional people. We've got immigrants. We've got women. We've got LGBTs. We've got everybody. We've got grandmas in this. But yeah, ultimately, it's still about keeping those with power in power and enforcing a system of ideological control in the process. But under the cover of this kind of, oh no, we're just fighting against racism and whatever else they claim to be fighting against.
So it's interesting. I started rereading. Nancy and I started rereading and also listening to the audiobook because I'm doing different things with it. The reading of it is for the cognition part of it, because that's how I take in information quality, the most pristine quality of information I take in by reading, and then an audiobook so that I can kind of do dictation into my own notes, because I'm taking a lot of notes on it. And I was thinking about it today as I was listening to it, and I wrote a note on it, just that it was the CHEXA, which was the GDU, which was the Extraordinary Commission for Struggle Against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation. Do you remember that?
What is this from?
That is from the Gulag Archipelago.
Okay.
And
yeah.
And I last read it, 30 years ago. And I think it was really the life of Ivan that I really focused on more at that time. But I was really impressed with the name of the Extraordinary Commission for Struggle Against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation, because it sounds like something that could be implemented here with a little bit better with a little bit more imaginative focus group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the end game for a lot of these people. I think that's exactly what they have in mind. That's why I say that you have it among some of these people, some extremely dangerous people with very dangerous views. Well, here's an illustration of this that I think is even more extreme. You may be familiar with a fellow named Ibram X. Kendi. He is someone who is now considered to be a leading commentator, even a scholar on anti-racism. He's gotten a lot of recognition among the chattering classes or whatever for being this bold anti-racist writer. And his think tank actually was given a $10 million donation by Twitter. So where we are now. But in one of Ibram X. Kendi's books, he outlines what kind of governmental system he wants. And he argues that the highest body of government should be what he calls the Department of Anti-Racism. And this Department of Anti-Racism has the power to overrule any policy of any level of government, anywhere, state, local, or federal, if it's deemed to be racist. The members of this Department of Anti-Racism would not be elected. They would be appointed based on their anti-racism credentials. In other words, they would be ideologues in critical race theory, like this fellow is. All right. So these people would be basically the highest body of government, and they would have the power to overturn the elected branches of government at any point if something was deemed to be a policy was deemed to be racist. And somebody asked him if there's any such thing as a race-neutral policy. And he said no. And for example, he was asked, well, are tax cuts, is that a race-neutral policy? And he says no, because tax cuts help white people more than black people. This guy's idea of what the state should be is basically identical to the Ayatollah Khomeini's idea of the Council of Guardians, where the highest body of government is like a council of Islamic scholars who are, from the correct sectarian tendencies, who basically, and still today in Iran, have the policy to overrule virtually any policy that the secular government, even the president, enacts. Also, another thing it reminded me of was the late Dr. William Pierce, who was the author of the Turner Diaries. He was an American neo-Nazi leader who headed up an organization called the National Alliance. He once said that his ideal model of government would be something where the highest body of government was what he called an Aryan religious order, where basically it was like a monastery that you have people who are so pure in their ideology that they're never going to backslide into whatever they would backsliding would be, and they're going to have the highest body of they're going to be empowered to appoint all the other sections, functions of government, based on ideological criteria. And that's exactly what this fellow Ibram X. Kendi is advocating for. This Department of Anti-Racism idea. It's the mirror image of this thing that you just quoted from the Solzhenitsyn book.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's interesting that you mentioned him. I've only seen him when Jack Dorsey gave him $10 million. Which I didn't think of particularly as a lot of money, but I guess it has a lot of symbolic. What it does actually is it gives him a lot of legitimacy. And Jack Dorsey knows that him giving $10 million because of the strength of his name also gives that person, Ibram X or whatever it is, a lot. That's collateral for him to raise additional funds with saying, "Hey, Jack gave this to us."
Right. Well, Kendi at one point when he was younger belonged to a cult that thought that white people were space aliens. I mean, that's how serious an intellectual this guy is, and I think he's repeated that viewpoint. But this guy aspires to be the American Robert Mugabe. I mean, that's basically his goal. And
do you feel that that's? And here's a question, and I want to be responsive to because it ties into it. So, not a beamer. Thank you so much for joining us. I like the image. That's kind of like one of those little things, like a maze, right? So are corporations woke as a PR move? Do they hide their sins to the Twitter mobs? And so here's a good example of that. Is this something where Jack Dorsey is kind of avoiding the mob at the door that's pounding down the door? And is this something where Ibram I don't know if that's his name. I don't want to misstate his name. I want to be respectful to his name. I'll just call him X because
Ibram.
Ibram. Is this something where he's just trying to acquire, some type of a social advancement where he's kind of going to that black management type of class, a progressive one?
Right. I think if that was his goal, he wouldn't take quite the extreme positions that he does. As for Dorsey, who knows? He seems to spread money around a lot of political tendencies, so I think he's just kind of covering all of his bases. As far as the question here, are corporations woke as a PR move? Yes, in many instances. In fact, they teach this in business schools now. I've actually seen this. I've actually reviewed business school curriculums where they teach you how to market your corporation as a woke corporation, as a socially responsible corporation, as an ethical corporation, as a green conscious corporation. It's basically like, well, you have, from the other side of the cultural spectrum, you've got corporations that are Christian oriented, like Chick-fil-A. Right. And in business schools now, they teach you, how to market your corporation as a woke corporation. That's sort of like the woke Chick-fil-A or something. You're all about environmental sustainability and social justice and equal opportunity and Rainbow Pride Month and BLM and whatever else you're into. And it's all just about building what they call stakeholder relationships, which basically means, you're trying to create an image for your corporation as a bunch of benevolent do-gooders. That's exactly what it is. Now you have people in corporate America who really believe in all this stuff too. And you have others for whom it's totally cynical. So it works different ways. Just like, in on the other side of the cultural spectrum, if you could find people in a Christian oriented company that really believe in Christianity and others that could care less, they just it's just going through the motions to.
Well, I will say, I recall, because I'm very involved in tax inversions for my own type of stuff, and that's how money moves, and finds favorable tax rates, right, and finds favorable tax treaties,
right.
And ultimately, there's a destination for it, so it'll travel through some type of a tax haven and then move back to Delaware, or however. There's lots of ways to structure it. But at the same time that, I guess it was Unilever or Procter & Gamble was promoting toxic males. Do you remember that? Toxic male masculinity or whatever it was, toxic males?
Yeah.
And their offices were being raided in Europe for tax evasion. And I'm like, if that's a toxic corporation.
Yeah.
Their offices were actually being raided there. Their offices were being raided in South America as well for using these illegal vehicles for as tax routes for their own kind of way the revenue travels. So I want to go on to something else, and then we're going to have to start closing up because it's been late, and I so much appreciate your time. So Clay Space, thank you again so much for joining us. Says, I've got a theory for you. I'm going to give this to you first, but first I'm going to say his question, then I got a theory for you. Clay Space, thank you so much for joining us. Says LGBTQ, and I think there's some more letters to add to that now. I don't know. I want to be respectful to it. I just don't know what the letters are, so I'll say YB. No, YL. No, L's already been taken. YM. LGBTQYM. Okay. Extremism breaks down a straight male bond, and I'm going to say something first. Okay, because I want to get your thoughts on this. Because you have such a good, I've listened to you in so many of your casts. You're really good at breaking these down within a social phenomenon and bringing it into kind of some scholarship. But Demi Lovato just came out and said that she's non-binary. At the same time, she's got a new album, right? It's craziness. And what would happen if, it's a serious question now, what would happen if everybody in America just declared themselves non-binary, I want to be respectful to Black Lives Matter, but put the Black Lives Matter logos wherever it's required. They would, if everyone did what's required to be compliant with those who are kind of keeping track of compliance, right? So that would be non-binary. I would put in my pronouns would be Tom / Cruz, whatever it would be, and then I would say something about Black Lives Matter, right? And wouldn't that topple our system? Wouldn't that be like a run on the woke bank? What would happen?
No, it would just represents the formation of the kind of cultural consensus we had, say, back during the 1950s. I mean, if people did that, it would be no different than, say, in the 1950s. You had, let's assuming social media had existed back then, you would have people putting up their American flag and their
But then
anti-communist.
how could they go after somebody if I had that? And thankfully I'm not a target of anything. I'm liberal, and I don't know. People just leave me alone with their stuff, and hopefully they understand my spirits with everything are good, right? But if I was to declare myself non-binary, then I cannot be persecuted for not having any type of compassion and empathy for those that are non-binary, right? Because I'm one of them.
Oh, no, they would make up some new social hierarchy. I mean, you find another thing you find in progressive activist circles is you have this thing called progressive stacking, and basically what that means is how much recognition you are entitled to depends on how many oppression cards you have. So if you are, say, a racial minority and a female and a lesbian, and you starting to identify as non-binary, and you have, say, an amputated leg, well, you've got at least 5 or 6 different categories there, right? So you get more recognition for how oppressed you are. Increasingly, there is a lot of attacks on gay men in these circles as being sexist, or particularly white gay men, So I mean, they don't. There's never any end to this. Is the point? There's never any end to this stuff. They just keep developing new configurations and new systems of stratification based on the latest moral panic or whatever it is that they're engaged in. So there's it's one thing that's interesting about this stuff is how flexible it is. There's really never any end to it. I mean, there's a guy who makes fun of this stuff a lot. There's a guy named James Lindsay. He's a commentator who at one point he and Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, they're philosophers who are they're all liberals, but they criticize this stuff a lot. And they wrote all these fake academic papers and got them published in academic journals. And they're just totally joke papers about things like rape culture among dogs, or, I mean,
which is a problem. Which is a problem. I've seen it.
Could be. But yeah, I mean, it was, about all these kinds of things like that. And they actually got published with some of this kind of stuff. Yeah, so I mean, what they do is they keep making new categorizations of the oppressed, and there's really no limit as to how far you can take this. Like one example is, are transracial people legitimate? Right, like you may remember a few years ago, there was a case of a woman who I think was an official in the NAACP.
I told everybody today, or yesterday, that people should be transracial. But you're saying if people are transracial.
All right, here's the deal with this. A few years back, there was a woman in Washington State, I believe, who was an NAACP.
Continue talking. I'm going to just put my cats away. So continue talking. I'll be back in 1 minute.
She was an NAACP official. I believe she was a professor of Black Studies or African American Studies at some college or university. But she was officially Black, but it actually turned out she was white. This was actually a white woman, and she had changed her appearance to make herself look passably Black, in the sense of hairstyles and skin tone and all that. I don't know exactly how she did it, but she was somebody who could pass for a light-skinned Black person. So, but she was exposed for doing this, and I think she was fired from the position she had, and this didn't go over well. But her defense was that she is a transracial person. That is, she may have been born white, but she self-identifies as Black. And I have seen debates take place in some of these kinds of circles, woke circles, about, is that or is that not a legitimate identity? And if someone can be transgendered, why can't they be transracial? And if race doesn't exist as a category, as a legitimate biological category, then why can't you change your race as well? So that's really the gist of this. Rachel Dozal, the person in the chat here says, points her name out. Rachel Dozal was her name.
Thank you, Louis.
But but then you can take this even further. There's a movement called the other kin. All right, these are people who self-identify basically as non-human entities. They self-identify as animals, as vampires, as extraterrestrials, as ghosts, as all kinds of things. You can find some of these people online and see where they've had plastic surgery to make themselves look more like a lizard or whatever it is that they self-identify as. And I'm not making any value judgment about this. I'm just simply saying that this is the ethos that drives some of this kind of thing in terms of how, what are you willing to accept? And then if some, you have a big dispute going on in left activist circles between the transgender community on one hand and what's called TERFs. You have these people that are called TERFs, TERFS, which means trans exclusionary radical feminists, right? And these are feminists who do not recognize trans women as legitimate women. And what their argument is, well, these other folks, they can't just, castrate themselves and then claim that they're oppressed as women when we really are women and we really are oppressed as women. It's this is a serious issue in some left activist circles. And there's an infinite number of configurations that you could create.
Do you know? I know a good friend of Nancy and myself is trans, and I guess the definitions of these things have changed. But she's trans in that she went through the sexual reorientation, whatever. And I want to be very respectful because she's such a dear friend. I think that's the term for it. Maybe she went through the surgery and she completed it. And she seems much happier now. So good for her. She's a wonderful person. Yeah. And she voted for Trump. And I knew her in her former self, I suppose. Again, I want to be respectful. And we were friends because we would talk at the gym. Or she would always be running. And gender reassignment. So thank you very much, gender reassignment. And then when she became a woman, we didn't speak for some time, and then I guess about a few weeks later, we started speaking again, and I asked her what North Carolina gender bill about going to the bathrooms, remember that, was a big thing, and I remember just going up to her and saying, what do you think about this? Is this something that you're kind of politically engaged in? And I remember her saying, I just want to pee. I thought that was really interesting because there's a real authenticity to her. She voted for Trump. She voted for Trump. She was very happy with Trump. She did not like his ban on transgender people in the military. And she actually explained that to me about why she thought that was really wrong. She thought that he was very wrong with doing that. And now she persuaded me too that was very wrong of Trump to do. So I'm in agreement with her on that. She's very anti-woke. She just wants to be like a happy, beautiful woman. So I thought it was very interesting. I didn't know that that there's now kind of stratification within that as well. I thought she maybe kind of reached the final, the highest plateau that one could reach. I didn't know that there was now kind of battles. And she's not a person that's fighting to compete in men's sports. I didn't realize that they are now kind of being taken down as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's an infinite number of conflicts that emerge in these circles. I mean, because it has its own dynamic. It never really ends. There's no final point. There's no final end game where it's like, okay, we're now where we want to be. That's it. Thank you very much. It just keeps spiraling.
That's amazing. I had no idea. I saw that gay men are clinging on to some type of kind of former prestige that they had and former social rank that they had, that they still kind of use the vernacular and they still kind of appropriate the terminology of kind of revolutionaries and radicals. However, they definitely now seem to be no longer have a kind of that victim card, however you described it, that stack. They're no longer anywhere near the bottom of the stack. In fact, they're now kind of the top. And now they've got it again. I see it in real time that people are now kind of competing in terms of the outrageousness. I guess we all see it. I mean, you can see it escalating progressively now, almost daily.
Well, you know, there was a controversy recently I saw taking place where there was a debate about the degree to which kink should be presented at pride marches. Like, you have some people who say, well, of course we should have pride marches, but they should be family-friendly pride marches, you know, where it's like gay families, like same-sex couples that are married to each other with kids and that kind of stuff. And then there's other folks who want it to be, you know, like BDSM and, you know, all this kind of stuff. You know, that's actually another point of contention at this point.
But why do they feel that they need to find children in libraries? Because you and I are the same age. I'm 54. You know, I guess you're close to me as well. We grew up in libraries, right? A lot of people 40 plus grew up in libraries. That's like the most vulnerable place to find a kid. That's like at their most vulnerable place.
Right.
So why do they feel that that's kind of like their own colonialization? They're colonizing that library space.
Are you talking about like the drag queen story hour thing?
Yeah, it's really surprising that that's now no longer this kind of a localized type of phenomenon. That's actually
as critical of woke as I am, I could never get that worked up about the drag queen story hours, because to me it was just always kind of like bringing a clown in to, you know, read stories.
But it's not. You know why? Because, you know, I know a lot of Muslim people. I know a lot of people who are very devout in their religions, Christian, Catholic, whatever it is, Jewish, and they want to be able. You know, we're a very liberal country. America was founded as a liberal country. We're always going to be a liberal country, and they just want to have that freedom where they can kind of define these terms and how to explain it to their children, how to interact with their children, how to get their children to be compassionate into other people's identities, using in their own environment rather than in an environment that that the parent isn't allowed really to be included within.
Right, I see. Yeah, well, you know, one long-standing debate that I have with a lot of people on the left has to do with subcultures that are not "quote unquote" liberal. You know, like like the zeitgeist of the present moment is basically, you know, diversity, inclusion, and what's the other one? Equity, and, you know, the rainbow culture and multiculturalism and all this kind of stuff. And I've always been like, yeah, okay, but what about people who dissent from this dominant ethos? You know, like the classic example was the case a few years ago, the guy with the gay wedding cake. Like, you know, you had a Christian guy who owned a bakery and he didn't want to make a gay wedding cake, and then he was sued for gay discrimination, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court kind of gave a kind of middle of the road ruling, like, well, yeah, he can kind of discriminate, but if he wants, but he kind of can't either. You know, it's sort of kind of left it open a bit. You know, I tend to lean towards the view that in any kind of society, irrespective of what the dominant ethos is, the overarching metaculture, that you have to have toleration for subcultures, even if they are in conflict, greatly in conflict with the dominant ethos. You know, for instance, and in the case of these issues, one issue I see is that when you start telling very devoutly religious people that they cannot practice their own values, you know, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Orthodox Judaism or something else, you know, you have to be woke. You have to accept all this. You know, in your own schools and churches and businesses, you know, you can't just have your own enclave either. You've got to practice this other prevailing ethos. What that does is fuel extremism. You know, because people with that viewpoint start to think, okay, clearly this wider society is not going to ever tolerate us, right? Therefore, we cannot peacefully coexist with this wider society. Therefore, we have to be enemies of this wider society.
What we really need, say, for example, is a theocracy that reflects our own values. I saw this happen myself at one point when I was growing up. In the 70s, I grew up in a very conservative area of Virginia, probably one of the most conservative areas of the United States. And the subculture I was part of was a very, very conservative, very fundamentalist, evangelical Protestantism. And increasingly, I would see people around me in that culture taking a very hostile stance towards the mainstream society, saying they're out to get us. They don't want us to be able to pray. They don't want us to be able to say we don't agree with homosexuality. They don't want us to, they're not going to let us have private schools that teach what we want to teach. They're not going to let us go to church eventually. They're not going to let us do what we want to do, what's based on what's important for them. And I saw people turning towards extremist ideologies that reject the idea of church-state separation, that reject the idea of democratic government, that they reject the whole liberal tradition and say, no, that doesn't work. We need theocracy because peaceful coexistence can't exist. So we've got a rule. And I think that when you start pushing wokeness or other things like that to the nth degree, that is what you're fueling from the other side of the spectrum. Like I saw a report that was done by Robert Pape. He's a professor at the University of Chicago. And he did an interview with Christine, what's her name that's on CNN, Alma Moore or something like that.
Amanpour.
Yeah, well, he was talking about the people that participated in the riots at the Capitol on January 6th. And he did an interesting breakdown of who these people are. And he said it's not true that most of these people were unemployed or, come from the subcultures that are commonly associated with right-wing extremism. They weren't typically militia members. They weren't typically members of white supremacist groups. So they weren't Proud Boys. Most of them were people that in every other area of life were seemingly, quote unquote, respectable or mainstream. Many of them were married. The average age was in their 40s and 50s. These were not young people. They were, some of them owned businesses. They had jobs. They were in middle management. Some of them were CEOs. But Robert Pape noticed that what the common denominator is that an overwhelming number of them came from regions of the country where whites are now the minority. That is, they came from geographical areas where, we have a white majority in the country as a whole, 60-some%. But they came from areas where whites are a minority. And the common theme among all of their ideas, whatever the rest of their ideas were this idea that they're being replaced in an ethnocultural sense, the great replacement theory that some of the far right holds to. And I think the issue there is, regardless of what the issue is, when you start pushing wokeness to the nth degree, you start fueling this kind of backlash, this kind of extremism. I come across that all the time with people on the right. Whenever I talk to red tribers, they're always like, look, this other side, they want to kill us, right? They want to kill us. They want to put us in jail. They want to put us in concentration camps. They want to make this country like this former Soviet Union. And that's the mindset that's how they perceive their enemies. Now, of course, you see that from the other side as well. They see, the orange man as a fascist and all this kind of stuff. But I think that's a real consequence of the woke ideology, is that it has the effect of fueling the very same right-wing extremism that the left claims to fear.
So I'll tell you something interesting that you were making me think of, and then I know we have to wrap up, and there's some people, I want to be responsive to a couple of questions. Two quick comments, and one of them is going back to, these ideological police. Because you made such an interesting point, and one I hadn't considered, and one that's particularly top of my mind now, as I wrote down that note, and I'm looking at it right now, the Extraordinary Commission for Struggle Against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation. It sounds very similar to what the Department of Homeland Security is now calling something patriotism, like extreme patriotism or something. And some of the characteristics of that, they said, were feeling that the government is corrupt, that it's extended beyond its constitutional rights, and and that the tax regime is not legitimate. And it just reminds me now that we're dealing with such harsh taxes, and I've told everybody that they have to invest, that we're seeing taxes that are going so high, well beyond what we were even seeing in Europe. I mean, we're just on a light, it's remarkable. The path we're on is warp 7, I guess, in Star Trek lingo. That the taxes are being made so high. So a lot of people saw this document, this leak that Darren Beatty got from Revolution, where it said extreme patriotism, these are the properties of it. And a lot of people were comforted. They said, well, I pay my taxes so I don't have to worry about it. And one of the tactics that I fear is being used, just as you say, that defund the police, if you just project that out, just logically in terms of a mathematical kind of a sequence, this is what has to happen, which makes a lot of sense, that taxes are also being made so high that they'll be completely intolerable. And then that invites investigation of why people aren't paying their taxes. And it just seems to be the same type of mechanisms that are being employed to really encroach upon people's liberties. And the other point I was thinking about that I took notes on when you were discussing the CIA was something you and I discussed offline, which is the interesting thing to me about it. People with the person who was a male who was talking about their gay identity and themselves within it. They were reading a book by Jane McGonigal, which is fine. She's one of the greats. But it just seems to me that they were laughing at the actual grunt people, and they were the middle management bureaucrats. And it's kind of like a new class that's emerging of bureaucrats within these establishments because their core competency no longer exists. And then lastly, the other thing I was thinking of when you were discussing James Lindsay, right? Mm-hmm. And I a lot of people on Twitter, so I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with some of the things he's done. And so there's obviously a whimsy to them, but there's also a real problem that he indicated and his colleagues indicated is that one of the things I've seen with the schools all changing their standards, which they're all doing both in high schools here, Stuyvesant, I'm sure you're familiar with Stuyvesant, one of the top public schools, in the world, I guess, in terms of mathematics, right? It doesn't get more prestigious than that. Is they're changing it so that the standards for all these schools now is really based upon some type of autoethnography. Are you familiar with what's happening with autoethnographies is now being part of like the equivalency of an SAT? No,
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, it's what they're now doing in the schools, where some type of life experience from a high schooler or a college person should displace any type of mathematical or English or any other type of scholastic achievements.
So instead of taking an SAT, you just write a paper on how I spent my summer vacation or something.
Yeah, but the nature of autoethnography, as James Lindsay, has written about, is you have to find some way in which you were victimized. And they're horrible. I've seen a lot of women's studies ones and gender studies and queer studies. They're really, really horrible types of things, and they're being peer reviewed. Like the committees that are approving it, or the PhD or the in its PhD review, are people who graduated with the same type of distinctions just a few years ago, also with PhDs in gender studies and queer studies, and now it's trickled down into the lower schools. It's also now kind of the entrance into these normally high achieving schools, including Harvard, is now using these particularly for their minority students to determine acceptance.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the more elite you go in the educational system, the more you actually find this stuff, although it's having a trickle down effect where you're finding it even in, community colleges and those kinds of places. And now in high schools and K through 12, they're starting to bring all this stuff in. So, yeah. This is the new self-legitimating ideology of the state, of the ruling class. This is, it's no different than, in the Soviet system, Marxism and dialectical materialism and Leninism and all that were the self-legitimating ideology. And in the Third Reich, it was the Nazi racial theory. And then in past times in the United States, it was the American civil religion. And, back in the 1950s, in some places to graduate from high school, you had to take a loyalty oath, basically, affirm your loyalty to the state. And this has become the new loyalty oath. Being woke and affirming all of these pieties is the new wokeness. This is something you may find interesting. I wanted to point this out because this is something I wrote on Facebook a few months ago, and I'll just go through this very quickly. What I was doing was talking about the culture wars, and I was saying that the left, right, and the center are the post-Enlightenment West version of Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox, or Sunni and Shia and Alawite. These are essentially religious conflicts, and then in U.S. politics, it's a conflict between those who take theology literally and those who take it metaphorically in many instances, or between what I call Galatians 3:8 Christians, that is that's a biblical passage that is all about, the brotherhood of man. God respects neither Jew nor Gentile, nor man nor woman, nor slave nor free. So that's the more liberal side of the spectrum. And then what I call Romans 1:27 Christians, that's one of the verses of the biblical text that's considered to be anti-gay. At least that's often interpreted that way. And then I said that even many people on the left who are avowedly secular, and many of them are, they have their own 7 deadly sins. Instead of the traditional 7 deadly sins, I don't know what they are. I should know because I don't want to miss out on any. But but it's what is it? Gluttony and greed or whatever. It says,
I think Bill Nye is number 3 or 4 in there.
Yeah. Well, so the left has their own 7 deadly sins of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, and then this or that denialism, like climate change denialism or whatever, COVID denialism. They have their own pantheon, with progress being elevated as the supreme god in the pantheon, kind of like Brahma in the Hindu pantheon. And then they have, emanating from that, these lesser gods like science, health, ecology, equality, race, gender, sexuality. They can even trot out their own Damascus Road conversion narratives. You have people like Derek Black, who's the son of the guy who founded the Stormfront website, or Fred Phelps' son, Nate Phelps, or Frank Schaeffer. He's the son of Francis Schaeffer, who was one of the founders of the religious right. They have these guys that they'll bring out as, they were off in this dark world of sin, and then they became enlightened. And in this ideology, they even have their own Satan, fascism. Fascism is not just some ideology that existed in the early to middle 20th century in certain parts of the world among countries with certain levels of economic development. It's sort of like this all-encompassing evil metaphysical force. So the woke ideology is this. It is essentially a religion. It has all the features of a religion: a pantheon, sins, conversion narratives, redemption narratives, an enemy bad guy god that you're supposed to fight against. The ultimate objective of these folks is to create what we would call a secular theocracy. Like, I know you're familiar with Paul Gottfried. Paul Gottfried has a book called A Secular Theocracy. He's talking about that's the end game with all this kind of stuff. It's about creating this ideological superstructure that is imposed by the state as a type of self-legitimating ideology that functions in the same way as a theocracy. It has heretics, it has apostates, it has blasphemy, it has all the features of a traditional religion.
I'm actually Googling that so I can put it on my books to order. Paul is great. Paul is really, really good. And I've really enjoyed the times that, I've watched it more than once, so I can say times, but I think it was only once. The times that I saw you and Paul engaged in some real intellectual interplay. I thought it was really good, and I was so concerned, and I had my own concerns. That is about about even our conversation. I thought I might have to bring in Paul Gottfried to keep it scholarly and academic, and keep the intellectualism intact rather than have me destroy these things, because I do. And I want to be respectful of your time and everybody's time because I know we've been on for a while. Just a couple of questions I have for you. Would that be all right?
Yeah, sure.
I'm so curious about how, and I told this to Paul back in September when I was on their thing, how the left and the right, and I'm not particularly aligned to the right, or myself particularly aligned to the left. The left today resembles a lot of the Republican Party that I disliked in the 2000s. I mean, I'm very anti-war. When you said the militarization of the police, it's something that's always haunted me, and I've seen it, and it's just scary. Actually, I've got another question for you. When you saw the disruptions happening in Chaz and Seattle, the continuing disruptions happening in Seattle, one of the things I thought about was I don't want the federal military coming in with their big tanks. I'm like, that's exactly what power wants. Mm-hmm. And Trump was even saying, we're going to bring in our big, if they can't handle it, we're going to bring in our big thing. We're going to bring in the heavy equipment. And I'm like, this is the worst thing that could ever happen is bringing in the heavy equipment.
Yeah. Well, you had some people in the Republican camp calling for bringing in the sending out the army and that kind of stuff. In fact, there was a controversy because Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, he wanted to send out the army to suppress the riots. Then he wanted to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times advocating this, and they wouldn't publish it. So that was another big issue. Yeah.
But so when you see, I'm sorry.
I think the problems with Chaz or CHOP or whatever it was called, though, were exaggerated. I mean, they would talk about the violence that took place within that area, as if there's not violence in plenty of other, American big cities, particularly during that time period. So I think a lot of that was kind of blown out of proportion. But
I don't know. I'm really interested, and where's this book again? I'm really interested in the conversation. Nancy, where did I just put Jack's book? I'm really interested in the conversation with Jack, because he was there. He was actually in Chaz, and see, there's his book. I was actually number one. Nobody was supposed to know this. I was actually buyer and getter of it number one, which is pretty cool. So he actually infiltrated Antifa, and I think I'm very inquisitive with what his experiences were within him. I don't particularly think it was underplayed. I think it was. I don't think it was overplayed. I think perhaps it was actually underplayed. The amount of violence that was going on there. I'm very familiar with some of the tactics that were being used, with the hierarchical structure that was being used. I'm very familiar with kind of the Chinese Communist Party using these type of insurgencies and how they've done junkets, bringing people out to China. I'm very intimately familiar with them. So I saw a lot of the apparatus and a lot of the organizational charts that were very militarized, that were not just kind of incidental, type of things that led to a Chaz. It was all very kind of methodical. Mm-hmm. And they even created their own governance structure. So they created kind of this woke governance structure. And they had something called the conflict, and this is just off the top of my head now, but the Conflict Resolution Advisory Council. Did you ever hear of that? And And in itself, what they did, which was very humorous, but it was also very disturbing, is they continued to add edits to it and, kind of improvements they thought to it, which required quotas of Asians, an Asian who's not male, a Native American who's non-male, a Latinx person who's non-male, and then making sure that there was more black people, and they were actually writing down the actual quotas that needed to be fulfilled with it. And then they continued to do edits of it down to where it got to, I think like edit 10 or edit 6, where there was, they felt that they needed people who had served jail time to serve on it. They feel that they needed some people who had been accused or had served time for child offenses with children, sexual offenses with children. And they put this all on paper. So this is not something I'm trying to embellish. So they wanted people who had, they said that they had women there who felt uncomfortable in the case of Chad, in the case of this committee having to mediate some type of a grievance, that they felt uncomfortable with, that the women would feel uncomfortable if there was if some of the committee was made up of criminals with a history of committing sexual crimes. So then they started placing kind of like caps on the number of people that could have that had served jail time for premeditated sexual assaults or rapes within a certain amount of time. I think they said a person is not eligible if they served time for rape within the last 12 months. And however, homeless people were exempted from, I mean, they created something that was really very, very bizarre, but just in terms of its operational qualities, it requires violence in order to enforce that. So I think what they were doing is I think they were torturing people inside some of those buildings. This requires extraordinary amount of torture, extraordinary amount of cruelty, because otherwise people who are the participants in it, who are trying to get out of it, or who might squeal or might inform or might interfere in drug transactions, the other types of things that happen there. And I think they did wind up finding a dead body, at least one of them in there. I mean, I think it was actually a very violent place.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I would imagine that it was violent. Whether it's more violent than just than Chicago or somewhere like that, I'd be surprised if it was. Maybe a different type of violence for different reasons. But no, what you're describing though is exactly what I have seen many, many times in these circles. Nothing you said was anything I found surprising or out of the ordinary. I'm not surprised by a single thing you just mentioned.
And so if you don't have the military coming in there, I really didn't want the military. I offended a lot of conservatives who were upset with me when I was saying the last thing we want is the military coming in there. I don't care what Trump says. I don't care what Tom Khan says. Care about anything. The military comes in there, you got a whole different problem with that, right? And how can you resolve that from your experience, from what you've seen, just clinically, what you've seen? How do you resolve problems like that and delegitimize them?
I tell you what my personal view is as an anarchist is Seattle can just be a communist city-state. They've got a statue of Lenin there, so let them have it.
Do they really?
I live on the other side of the country. I'm not worried about what they do in Seattle.
Do they really have a statue of Lenin there?
It's on private property, though. It's not a public statue like, say, George Washington or something. It's actually, ironically, it's on a communist, icons is on private property. But yeah, they do have a big statue of Lenin there. People will make an issue of that when you have like to say.
But does that become something? I'm just so interested in. This is a conversation I had a little bit with Paul. Now I'm having with you. I'm going to have it with Jack. I've seen this in India a lot, where the left gets kind of franchised out, and no matter where you run to, the left, kind of the Antifa, Black Bloc type of militancy, right? Will chase you wherever enclave you find yourself in.
You said where have you seen this?
In India is a real problem. So
I mean the Naxalites and all that.
What is that?
The Naxalites, the Maoists, the Communist Party of India, and all. In the regions where the insurgency is taking place, and all that.
There's a lot of other considerations there, and I'd have to spend a long time kind of explaining kind of the political dynamics and the social structures there. But they have their own problems with the left. It's a lot of agitation that comes from Iran. It's a lot of agitation that comes from China to disrupt their social fabrics. But so, how do you stop kind of this Chaz model? I guess that's an extreme example, but the Seattle model of franchising all around the country.
Well, I think that's a question of, in the same sense of how does any authoritarian movement, how is any authoritarian movement controlled? I mean, let's say it wasn't the far left. Let's say it was, neo-Nazis. Let's say it was religious fundamentalists. Let's say it was, whatever,
Correct. Fair. Very fair.
How do you control any movement like that? All right. Question is, I don't know. I mean, given the level of fractiousness that we have in our society today, I don't take anyone's side in this culture war stuff. I'm not on the red tribe side either. What I tend to hope for is that they just all sort of neutralize each other. They all fight each other to the point that nobody really gets the upper hand. I tend to root for fragmentation in all of their ranks. By all means, let's pit the MAGAs against the Never Trumpers, against the QAnons, against the Proud Boys, against the TERFs, against the trans, against the Chaz, against the Antifa, against the Marxists. It's like, I see ideologies as religions. I view political ideologies the same way I view religions, in the sense I don't really believe in any of them. I think all of them are collections of myths and narratives and icons and taboos and rituals and all the things that make a religion what it is. Ideologies are like the modern version of religions, and then political interest groups generally and subcultures are like the modern version of, say, ethno-tribes or ethno-linguistic groups or something like that. So in a society where you have all these different and it doesn't have to just be the United States. I mean, it could be, Lebanon or Syria. In a society where you have all kinds of tribes and sectarian groups fighting with each other, who do you root for? Particularly if you don't like any of them. Well, the best possible outcome is that they all neutralize each other. Like that's eventually what happened in Lebanon. I find the civil war in Lebanon in the 70s and 80s fascinating because it seems to have started in a way that was very similar to what's going on today in the United States. And that is, you had all of these different sectarian groups. There it was mostly religion, but then religion was intersected with ethnicity and tribe and clan and family dynasties and not to mention social class and all kinds of other things. All right, so you had all of these sectarian communities that went to war with each other, and it was you had the Maronite Christians, the Shia, the Sunni, the Alawite, the Druze, the Palestinians, the communists. And you also had shifting alliances too. One team is on your side one day, then they're your enemies the next day. And this went on for 15 years in Lebanon. And Lebanon is a small country. It has 7 million people. It's about the size of one of our states. And eventually, what happened in Lebanon is that they all just kind of fought to a standstill to the point where they were able to create this governmental system that's sort of a power sharing arrangement. It's called consociationalism, but it's this idea that, okay, well, the Druze get X amount of representation and the Shia get X amount, and the Maronite Christians get X amount, and so forth. And I think that given how fractious American society is coming, that's where we're headed. I'm not saying there's going to be a civil war. I mean, we could go a long way before being in that condition, but we are becoming more like what you see in normal democratic societies around the world. Like the problem is a lot of Americans and Western Europeans are used to living in these kind of genteel, middle class type of societies where most people are middle class, but that's not the norm worldwide, even in democratic countries. Western Europe, North America, and Australia are the exceptions, not the rules. More in countries around the world, even ones that are democracies, in terms of how democracy is practiced, India comes closer to being the norm, or Indonesia, or Pakistan, or one of the African states, or some of the Latin American countries, Brazil, for example, and in societies like our own, where wealth disparities between rich and poor are becoming wider, becoming third world level, and where this wider society is fragmenting into all these different warring, the equivalents of religions and ethnic groups, or its subcultures and ideologies and all this, where nobody likes anybody else, but then everybody thinks the existing system is illegitimate. And then you have a ruling class that's increasingly fragmented within itself, and also the whole, everybody hates, all of the common people hate. That's how it.
Listen, within that system, this is so interesting to me. Within that system that you just described, and the way it's kind of collapsing, right? Do you see kind of maybe like intra-elite frictions also forming? Because if
Yes.
they're forming outside, then they should be forming inside also. So you see intra-elite type of factions
Yes.
forming also.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at the breakdown of the political parties, who backs the two major political parties? All right, the Republicans tend to be backed by the more traditional sectors of the ruling class. If you look at the industries, for example, well, one example is to just look up, and it's possible to do this. It's possible to look up the zip codes where the donors for each of the parties primarily originate from. For the Republicans, it tends to be older, more long-established industries. It's, Republicans are the party of big oil, big agriculture, big banking, all of that kind of stuff, as well as armaments and military-industrial complex. That's the Republicans. And the Sun Belt industries that emerged in the post-war period, that's a big part of their donor class. For the Democrats, it tends to be, if you look at where their donations come from, it's the D.C. area itself, the political class and lobbyists and all that. It's New York, which is basically the financial industry and the mass media, Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, the entertainment, the whole big tech configuration. So yeah, it's very similar to in the 19th century in European societies, the way you saw the split that took place within the elite between the rising capitalist class, the industrial bourgeoisie, as the Marxists called them, and then the traditional agricultural feudal class. You saw a big split between those in the 19th century in a lot of European societies in ways that involved violence as well. Like a lot of the revolutions of 1848, that's what they were. It was basically the bourgeois class, engaged in a revolt against the traditional royal, clerical, aristocratic elite. Now, we've never had that kind of traditional European elite in the United States. What we have had is this kind of old money elite, and then now that is being eclipsed by the rise of this new high-tech, more media-oriented, new money. Like in sociology, we call it the newly rich. That is, we have people who are filthy rich, but they're outside the traditional elite. They're not Rockefellers and Kennedys and all that. And then we also have what's commonly called the bourgeois bohemians. That is, people who are very bourgeois and upper scale and upper class in their socioeconomic position, but they're also very bourgeois and bohemian. I mean, very bohemian and almost countercultural in terms of their values, their personal values. I mean, yeah, they may have a bourgeois income, but then they're into BDSM. So we're seeing a rise of a new ruling class that is not this traditional ruling class. This traditional ruling class is slowly being displaced, and this is something that's been going on for quite some time. But yeah, we very much have fractitiousness in the elite. That's why we see the media fragmenting the way it is. You got one side that backs Fox, one side that backs CNN and MSNBC.
So I want to be respectful. I was actually just, looking through some of the questions. There were some really interesting questions here, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all of them. But so I want to just get to one point, and then I guess we're going to have to close it up because there are some really interesting things here. Is when you said that the way you see it as an anarchist, when you see Seattle's and you see these things kind of replicating, right, is you're saying, there at a certain point there's a replication crisis and they all just start battling it out with each other. And as an anarchist, that's probably the most optimal outcome, is that all the factions just kind of weaken each other up and just keep battling it out.
Right. Well, on the right, you see things like that coming from the right occasionally. You saw this Ammon Bundy people, the Bundy Ranch, and all that stuff a few years ago. So that was kind of like the Chaz of the right. It's we'll see more of that kind of stuff in the future too. We'll see more Chazes in the future, and we'll see more Bundy Ranch type situations in the future.
So then, so in terms of stuff, because I definitely don't want to see the military. I know I mean, I live right by Grand Central Station. Everybody there is like, you're living in a totalitarian type of system. I mean, we're talking big guns that are visual displays. They're not needed. They're definitely done as intimidation because they've already got, I know the technology that they've got. They don't need it at all. It's meant to be visual intimidation and not for tourists. It's meant to be intimidation for us, right? That's what I think. So if they replicate, that just means that the sides will continue to kind of, if they replicate and franchise into other cities, then so will the combatants also kind of be recreated into each different city. Now, what happens if you have one side, let's say woke, just out of convenience, where there's an asymmetrical power to it?
Well, I think you'll start to see more of that. I think you'll start to see, the wokeists becoming predominant in some places. There will be a backlash against that from the other side, and you'll see more street fights between these wokeists and Proud Boy types and militia types and Oath Keeper types, and you'll start to see different regions becoming more
So
different.
do the Proud Boys? I'm sorry, I'm so rude. I really apologize. I don't kind of apologize all the time, but I am rude. So here's a question for you. Okay, does the Proud Boys at some point get unleashed? Like right now, they've been harnessed. The media, the political apparatus, the policing apparatus has not allowed them to be violent, but clearly they show and I'm talking about Proud Boys as a collective. I don't know who the Proud Boys are. I know nothing about them. So I'm just referring to the backlash movement, right? Seems to have been restrained, that they're not allowed to kind of operate and be violent. Is there come a point where the police apparatus just says, let them go. We're going to let them be violent and battle it out?
I think you'll definitely see more of that in the future. It'll depend on the geographical area. When you have with this, our society's breaking down along geographical lines, along class lines, along ideological lines, along cultural lines. Remember that in a number of the Republican states now, they're trying to pass laws where it's legal to run over protesters in a car. So it's this is coming from all different directions. But I think that the kind of battles that we saw last year between the Antifa and Proud Boys and that kind of stuff, we'll see continue over time. We'll start to see more of that kind of stuff in different kinds of circumstances. I mean, it'll heat up for a while and die down, and heat up for a while and die down, and in different geographical areas, the local governments will favor one or the other to a greater degree. You also will start to see different groups simply nullifying wider governmental laws they don't approve of. One example was with sanctuary cities are an example of this. Like sanctuary cities where basically some localities, usually larger cities which are more liberal, were saying, well, we're just not going to recognize federal immigration law anymore. And in the state that I live in, and this has happened in a lot of other places, when they try to pass tighter gun laws, you have some more conservative, red zone counties saying, well, we're going to be sanctuary counties for Second Amendment people, for gun rights, so we're just not going to obey gun control laws. And we're going to see that happen in more and more circumstances as well. I've seen people say, well, if Roe v. Wade is overturned by the new Republican-dominated Supreme Court, well, we're going to have abortion sanctuary cities. Or I've seen other people say, well, we're going to have pro-life sanctuary counties. We're just not going to allow abortion clinics in our county no matter what,
But so the way you see everything then, if I understand correctly, is you see kind of two outcomes. You see either a completely totalitarian type of outcome where all of this is levered by a central government to just take all the apparatus of state, or where something gets federated, I guess is the term.
Well, the fragmentation is happening at the same time that the power elite is trying to hold on. And you've got sectors of the power elite that are trying to consolidate their position as well. I think that what I think the current administration really wants to do, if they had their, in their perfect world, as they would define it, is I think they want to purge anything to do with the right. I mean, I think if they had their way, Donald Trump would be in jail. The Trump organization would be shut down. They would rework the electoral system so that the Republicans could never win an election, through adding states and changing voting requirements and all that kind of stuff. I think they want to shut the right out of the political system entirely, and I think they want to get rid of the sections of the left they don't want either. I think that they are fine with weaponizing certain sectors of the left when it's convenient. For example, last year, when the riots were going on, I think they were hoping that would make Donald Trump look bad, like he couldn't keep order, make him look weak or whatever. But they don't want that going on Joe Biden's watch. They don't want anything going on that threatens the legitimacy of the state. And one thing I've noticed is that the left and the right always accuse the ruling class of being in league with the other side. Like people on the Antifa side of the fence, they're certain that the government and the Proud Boys and the militia and the Oath Keepers are all really on the same team. The Oath Keepers are just a more extreme version of the ruling class. And then the people on the right, they think the same thing. They think that the.
So let me ask you a question. I've got so many questions. You're so good at this, and you're awesome, truly awesome. Is that something that is being deliberately kind of like messaging that's being kind of surgically implanted into the population to see what Scott Adams calls two screens?
Well, no, it's always been perceived that way. During the upheavals of the 60s, it was perceived that way. The right wing in those days were certain that the the weathermen were actually in league with the government, and then the left was certain that the KKK was in league with the government as well. I mean, I don't really see it that way. I mean, you have the power elite, all right, what social scientists call the power elite, and that's sort of the intersection of institutional leadership, government, business, finance, military, in our system, today, technology, media, all those kind of, institutions generally. You have that power elite, all right, and then you have a system of layering within the power elite. There are some people who are more elite than other elites, the super elite, and then the different stratifications within the elite. And then you've also got different factions of the elite, a left wing of the elite, a right wing of the elite, with varying degrees of influence. Right? So the quote unquote elite, ruling class, whatever, is not some big monolithic entity, and it's not a conspiracy either. It's different groups vying for influence the same way there. And there are certain sectors of the elite that will make common cause with the left, the far left, when it's convenient. And then they'll discard them as soon as they don't need them anymore. And that's also true of the right. There are certain, like increasingly you see, I mean, this has been going on for quite some time, but, the Republicans probably since the 70s, if not the 60s, have always tried to weaponize the social conservative. They've always tried to, rally the religious fundamentalists and religious traditionalists, that whole, and the populist right, that whole sector. They've always tried to sort of rally that as a constituency. With Nixon, it was a silent majority, the Southern strategy. With Reagan, it was a religious right. Now it's the Trumpists and all that. And then the other side has always tried to do that. At least since the 70s, the early 70s, the Democrats have tried to cultivate the left as a constituency. Like I know Fred Dutton was a Democratic Party strategist way back in 1970 who actually outlined a plan for this, about how Democrats could cultivate, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the youth movement, all that kind of stuff as constituent groups. So this has been going on for quite some time. But so you have this elite, the elite that are ruling class, state, power elite, whatever you want to call them, that have their own system of layering, their own system of fragmentation, their own interworkings and maneuverings. And then at different points, they may try to reach out to other constituencies to as a base for themselves, but at the same time, they don't want anything that actually threatens the system. Like the system is just as opposed to, say, racist, white supremacist terrorists as they are to eco-terrorists and vice versa. Now, they don't want anything that's actually going to threaten the legitimacy and rule of the system, no matter who it is, left, right, center. I saw a report that was published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies just last year. Center for Strategic and International Studies is about as elite as it gets in terms of think tanks that are national security and homeland security oriented. And they were identifying all of these.
They're
groups.
very pro CCP, by the way. Just so you know, they're
because they're ultra globalists. They're ultra globalists, and they've always been very Rockefeller connected, Kissinger connected, Zbigniew Brzezinski connected. They represent the super strata of the power elite, which is very globalist and which does see China more as a, not so much as an adversary. They've never really seen China as an adversary, more as
an anarchist. So let me ask you, I'm so interested, and I want to make sure I say hello to Vijay Kumar. And it's early in IST time, right? It's early in India. So namaste. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll get to their question actually, do you mind if I get to their question now, and then we'll go back to your thing? Would that be all right? Because it touches on the same thing. There's no true benevolent power, so keep it distributed. And
that's anarchism. That's anarchism. Yeah. Thank you. You just made my case for me, sir, who asked this question.
Yeah. And I want to thank you so much, actually. Do you know how long we've gone on for? How long do you think this has been? Don't look at the clock. Don't look at
Yeah.
Amazing, right? A lot of fun.
Yeah. But the point I was going to make, though, about the Center for Strategic and International Studies is that, yes, it's true. They're very globalist. They've always been very globalist. That sector of the power elite has always seen China as more of a junior partner, potential colony / ally. They don't have this adversarial view of China, the way that some of the economic nationalists and some of those.
But they talk about human rights. What happens in China? In the I get upset about it, but yeah,
there's our human rights. Human rights are subjective. It's like Biden himself said about China that's just a different culture or something. But recently the C4SS, the Center for Strategic International Studies, they published a report about Homeland Security where they identified this long list of potential terrorist threats. And who did they identify? They were going down the whole list of radical pro-lifers, radical pro-choicers, radical environmentalists, animal rights people, militia people, gun nuts, religious nuts, racist nuts, communists, anarchists, Antifa.
And you know who's the biggest victim of that? When people say, hey, Adam, they're coming after white people or this or that, I'm like, have you read this stuff? They're not coming after white people. They're coming after low-income people that are trying to express dissent against a regime.
Right. Yeah. It cuts across the ideological boundaries and the cultural boundaries and the racial boundaries and all that. What they were attacking was anybody with an anti-system view. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be,
and who can't afford to challenge it.
Right.
And if you can't afford a lawyer, they're going to be after you, right? And the most vulnerable people are the most innocent. That's the way that system will work.
Right. Yeah. So the point, though, is that the system is not aligned with the left or the right or any of that. The system is aligned with the system. The system has its own internal factions, its own internal hierarchies. They're opposed to anything that's anti-system. That's how that works.
I wasn't sure if you stopped there or if the screen stopped. So we're gonna have to end it up. And Rising Serpent says, and thank you again, Rising Serpent, for joining us. They said this a while ago, and I just didn't get to it tonight. Is Keith on Twitter? Where can I read his thoughts and interact with him? And I apologize that I don't have it put on screen, but I'll make sure I include it within Twitter. Where can people find you? I found you on Cardo Godfrey, just so everybody knows.
There's a website.
I didn't see a website.
There's a website called attackthesystem.com, just like it sounds, attackthesystem.com. You can find me there. You can find links to my books, hundreds of essays I've written, blog posts. I post new material there every day. Former podcasts that I've done, all kinds of stuff.
I'm literally going to put it on the screen right now. It's Attack the System. I've actually was just listening to season 2, episode 15. So I'm just going to post that right up here. It's excellent. So hold on. Let me just post it up here. And I think this is right. And I'm going to do this. I'm good at technology, right? You're impressed. Okay, now watch that. That's right. That's correct, right?
That's it.
It's awesome. It's awesome. And then you have a book also, actually.
Well, I've got about half a dozen books. Though you could get those from the website as well, or you can to the publisher. You can get them right from the publisher.
And I was so busy typing away on this thing, I didn't hear what your response was when Rising Serpent asked you about your presence on Twitter.
I'm not on Twitter. I don't use Twitter.
So you're just kind of a spectator on Twitter where you just, Twitter is interesting. I use Twitter because I don't watch the news or anything, right? And Twitter, I follow Jack Posobiec, Cernovich, Scott Adams, a bunch of liberals, a bunch of right, a bunch of people in the middle, and then mostly my stuff, which is about technology and about defense industry in India and investments. Mostly Twitter is very good at curating reality in a way. So the people that I rely on are those people who are curating reality. The other interesting thing about Twitter is that it's probably the last of the social media engines that allows some type of a discourse, that permits some type of a discourse, that does allow some type of exchange. There are rules to their sandbox. You just have to conform to them. And in terms of what I'm doing, where I'm trying to write this chronicle of I imagine myself as Thucydides, and this is my Peloponnesian War. And you can get a lot of high quality information and perspectives off of Twitter that I don't think can get anywhere else. I mean, there's a remarkable quality to it that is kind of historic in its way. But it's good that you're not on Twitter. You're better off. You hate the place. You are awesome.
Well, thank you.
I had so much fun, and I want to close up, and this is going to be the look at what Scorbonius said. I appreciate this so much. Scorbonius, you know who that is?
No.
Michael Anton would know who this is. Scorbonius was, I don't remember if he was the counsel or the doctor for one of my favorite emperors of all time. Strangely enough, was Claudius. Or was it Augustus? It was Claudius. It was the last of the emperors, and I'm a big fan. So I read all that stuff because I'm crazy with that. So I'm going to put this thing back on the screen. You're awesome, and I pestered you to do this, and I so much appreciate it. I went to your website and I was like, let's do this, and then I reached out through channels because you're awesome, and I really wanted to learn more about the anarchist kind of overview, right, in a very informed type of way. And I really appreciate that you've really done that rather than to get stuck in kind of the ideological divisions and how they kind of exist within each other or don't exist within each other. I really appreciate that you kind of gave me that system view of it and helped me understand kind of what Vijay Kumar said is kind of the defragmentation of it and how that and the power that's generated from that defragmentation.
Yes.
You are awesome. I had so much fun. So what I'm going to do, watch this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click the button. You don't get to see it. Oh, Scorbonius said it was Claudius. So thank you very much. Claudius is great. Did you ever see that show, I, Claudius?
I did not know.
It's a great show. It's a great show. It's about the lineage of the Caesars, beginning with Augustus, who's one of the greatest administrators of an empire of all time. Him, Alexander the Great, really remarkable at how they administered. So Julius conquered, one of the greatest conquerors in history, obviously, right? One of the greatest conquerors in history. Very charismatic. However, he couldn't build an administration. He was incapable of building an administration that lasted beyond him, right? He was very charismatic. Was Augustus, who says that he found Rome in wood and he left it in marble. And it's really true how he did that. Very long term. Watch it. It's only like 13 episodes. It's really good. Right, Nancy? We love it. We love it. I watch it at the gym when I sometimes. So I want to thank you so much. You've been great. Truly, truly great. You've really helped me understand. Hopefully everybody else understand as well. And kind of your views on the thing, which one of the things I appreciate having listened to you now so much is that you really are very aware of not taking sides. Like you clearly keep awareness of not taking sides and really just trying to, I don't know if the right word is being a fair dealer, because a fair dealer is still a dealer, but just somebody, but you definitely keep that awareness of not taking sides and just trying to, present information and take in information. And I think of it kind of as the trolley problem in a lot of these instances. And you're definitely very aware of not being a participant in trying to solve the trolley problem and let it to the other. So it's very interesting. And you've been awesome. Right, Nancy? Nancy's listened to the whole thing. She's listened to it for 4 hours now. Good, right?
Yeah, love it.
I want to thank you again. So, Keith, I'm going to press the button. You can't see it. I see it, right? I get to see it. You don't see the button. I'm going to press the button, and it says end broadcast. That's what it says. And when I press the button, everyone's going to go, right? Except you and me. And then we'll spend like a minute offline. So, I see interior foliage. So I'm going to do one quick thing. Interior foliage. Interior foliage, thank you so much. This convo helped save the rainy New York City weekend. Yeah, today was a rainy day. So now I'm going to get our thing back up. Watch this. Now I'm going to get this back up, and I'm going to click the button, and we're done. So I want to thank you again, Keith, and I want to thank everybody else for allowing Keith and I to be the guest on your Twitter feed tonight. So thank you, everybody. And I'm going to click the button. Here it goes. Watch this. I got to press it one more time. Now it says, are you sure you want to end it? Yes, I do. And